listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Dark Dialogue Distilled. In the last episode, we examined the cell phone evidence in the Holly Bobo case. When investigators finally looked closely at the data, it revealed something deeply troubling. The timeline presented at trial simply did not align with the activity recorded by those devices. The phones were moving, communicating, and pinging in ways that made some of the prosecution's claim quite literally impossible. That episode focused on the physical evidence, the data, the towers, the timelines. But today we're going to turn to something else, a confession. Specifically, the confession given by Dylan Adams. I've been up to my ears in this thing, going through it piece by piece. And if you've been following this series, Dylan Adams is not a new name. He was a young man connected to several of the individuals eventually accused in the case. The brother of Zach Adams, who was eventually convicted of the case and whose post-conviction relief trial and hearing just ended in December of last year. At one point, Dylan told investigators that he had participated in the abduction and murder of Holly Bobo. Confessions carry enormous weight in criminal cases. When someone admits involvement in a crime, juries listen, investigators listen, prosecutors build cases around them. But confessions don't happen in isolation. They happen in environments. They happen under circumstances. And sometimes those circumstances raise questions just as serious as the confession itself. Because when Dylan Adams gave his statement, there was someone else involved. A guy by the name of Dennis Benjamin. And the deeper that you look into Dennis Benjamin's role in this investigation, the stranger it becomes. This wasn't simply a witness who happened to be nearby. At one point, Dylan Adams was living with Dennis Benjamin. Later, Benjamin would be present during the process that produced Adams' confession. And at one point, he was even left alone in the room with him. In a homicide investigation, that is unusual, extremely unusual. So today on Dark Dialogue Distilled, we're going to step away from the timeline and the tower pings for a moment, and we're going to examine something just as important. How Dylan Adams' confession actually happened, and how a man by the name of Dennis Benjamin somehow found himself sitting in the middle of it. So as you know, I'm your host, John. If you're new here, Distilled is where we step away from the full narrative of the case and focus on one specific piece of it, a detail, a question, a moment that deserves a closer look, something that just bothers me. Sometimes that means examining evidence, sometimes it means pulling apart testimony, and sometimes it means asking why something in an investigation happened the way that it did. So today's episode is a follow-up on our previous Distilled breakdown of the Holly Bobo case, where we examined the cell phone evidence, the timeline problems that emerged when the data was actually laid out. But today, like I said, we're shifted to something else, a confession. Specifically, the confession given by Dylan Adams and the unusual set of circumstances surrounding how that confession happened. If you enjoy investigative deep dives like this one, make sure that you're following Dark Dialogue on your podcast platform so that you never miss an episode. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, taking a moment to leave a rating or a review really does help the show reach more people who care about careful, evidence-based analysis of these cases. You can also find Dark Dialogue across social media, on YouTube, and at the website, where you'll find additional case resources and updates tied to episodes just like this one. So, with all that said, let's get into it. Now, before Dylan Adams ever lived with Dennis Benjamin, he was in federal custody. In September of 2013, a federal grand jury in Madison County indicted Dylan Adams on firearms charges. Specifically, he was charged with being an unlawful user of controlled substances and possession of firearms and ammunition, a federal offense that can carry some significant prison time. So on September 25th, 2013, Adams was arrested and taken into federal custody. Now, at this point, The Holly Bobo investigation was already moving rapidly. Zach Adams had been arrested earlier that year, and investigators were aggressively pursuing anyone that they believed might have knowledge of what had happened to Holly. While Dylan Adams is being held on federal gun charges, agents from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, or TBI, were already questioning him about the Holly Bobo case. So by the time Adams was sitting in federal custody, his name had already been entered into the orbit of the Bobo investigation. And that's where things begin to take an unusual turn, because instead of remaining in custody awaiting the normal course of federal prosecution, Dylan eventually reached some sort of a plea arrangement in the firearms case, and it was an arrangement that resulted in him being released without serving any additional jail time. But his release did not mean that he could simply go home. Instead, Dylan Adams was released to live under the supervision of a man by the name of Dennis Benjamin. Benjamin was a retired law enforcement officer, and according to accounts from the investigation, it was during this period, while Adams was living with Benjamin, that Benjamin reported something significant to investigators. He told them that Dylan Adams was ready to confess. That claim would eventually lead to the recorded statements the prosecutors later used to tie Adams to the abduction and the murder of Holly Bobo. But before we get to the confession itself, we've got to pause here for a moment, because the arrangement that put Dylan Adams, a man connected to suspects in an active homicide investigation, into the home of Dennis Benjamin raises some important and concerning questions. Questions about how that arrangement came to exist in the first place, and questions about what exactly was happening during the time that Adams was living there. Because from this point forward, Dennis Benjamin doesn't simply appear in the background of the story, he actively becomes a part of it. So this is the point in the story where things become difficult to explain, because Dennis Benjamin did not come into this case through Dylan Adams. He came into the case through the Bobo family. Benjamin was a retired Memphis police officer who, through law enforcement connections, introduced himself to Holly Bobo's family after the investigation had stalled. He presented himself as someone who could help, someone who knew investigators, prosecutors, and the systems at work. Over time, he became something like an unofficial investigator aligned with the Bobo family. Not a sworn officer, not a TBI agent, but someone who was clearly working on the victim's side of the case and communicating with law enforcement. And that's where the situation becomes extraordinarily unusual, because Dylan Adams had never met Dennis Benjamin before the court ordered him to live with him. No prior relationship, no family connection, no friendship, no nothing. Yet after Adams reached his plea arrangement in the federal firearms case, one of the conditions of his release was that he would live under the supervision of Dennis Benjamin. Think about that for a moment. A man connected to suspects in an active homicide investigation was placed in the home of a retired police officer who had inserted himself into the case on behalf of the victim's family. That is not a typical living arrangement, and it is not standard probation structure. It's not a halfway house. It's not supervised release through a federal program. Instead, Dylan Adams, a defendant with potential exposure in the Holly Bobo investigation, was effectively placed under the daily supervision of someone who had already aligned himself with the victim's side of that very case. And again, these two men had never even met before this arrangement began. For roughly 5 weeks, Dylan Adams lived in Dennis Benjamin's home, and during that time, Benjamin later reported something very important to investigators. He said Dylan Adams was ready to confess. Call would set in motion the events that produced the recorded confession prosecutors would later rely on in Holly's case, one we're going to be wading through, but When you step back and look at the structure of this situation, it raises an obvious question. How did a man working alongside the victim's family end up supervising a potential suspect in that same investigation? Because even before the confession happens, that arrangement alone is highly unorthodox. So now we need to pause and look at something very carefully, because the living arrangement between Dylan Adams and Dennis Benjamin isn't just unusual, it appears to be extraordinarily unusual. When courts impose conditions on someone awaiting trial or under a plea arrangement, they sometimes require that person to live with what's called a third-party custodian. That custodian might be a parent, a sibling, a grandparent, another relative, or occasionally a neutral adult who agrees to supervise the defendant and ensure that they follow the conditions of their release. But there is a critical feature in those arrangements. The custodian is supposed to be neutral. They are not investigators. They are not aligned with one side of a criminal case, and they sure as shit are not working on behalf of the alleged victim. In other situations, defendants may be supervised by former or current law enforcement officers, but when that happens, it occurs through formal institutional roles like probation officers, parole officers, halfway house supervisors, or other structured programs operating inside the criminal justice system. Those are official positions with clear legal authority and oversight. That is not what we're looking at here. Dennis Benjamin was a retired police officer. He was not Dylan Adams' probation officer. He was not a federal pretrial services officer. He was not operating a halfway house or a supervised release program. Instead, Benjamin had entered the Holly Bobo case through his relationship with the Bobo family themselves, presenting himself as someone who could help investigate the case and connect them with law enforcement contacts. So, when Dylan Adams was released on the federal gun case and ordered to live under Benjamin's supervision, the arrangement created something that is very difficult to find parallels for. And believe me, I tried. Hopefully you guys know me by now that I don't just say this shit, that I actually really do try to find something, but it is almost unheard of that a situation like this would exist. A criminal defendant connected to a homicide investigation, placed into the home of a retired law enforcement officer who is simultaneously assisting the victim's family in that same investigation. Modern legal databases are extensive. Case law is searchable. News archives stretch back for decades, and yet there are no widely documented examples of a situation that mirrors this structure, at least none that I could find. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's never happened anywhere in the country ever, but it does mean that this arrangement falls far outside the patterns typically seen in criminal justice practice, which raises a very simple question. How was this allowed to happen? How did a federal plea arrangement result in Dylan Adams being placed in the home of someone who was already working alongside the victim's family in the very case that investigators were questioning him about? Because before we even get to the confession itself, understanding how this arrangement was allowed to exist is a question that deserves some very serious attention. Now, legally, the entire structure of what happened here hinges on one very important distinction: whether Dennis Benjamin was acting as a private citizen or as a state actor, because under American constitutional law, that difference matters enormously. Most people are familiar with your Miranda warning, your Miranda rights, the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney, the warning that anything you can say can and will be used against you in court. Those warnings come from the Supreme Court's 1966 decision in Miranda versus Arizona. But Miranda protections do not apply to every conversation about crime. They apply only to custodial interrogation by law enforcement or by someone acting on behalf of law enforcement. If a suspect voluntarily speaks to a private citizen, then Miranda simply does not apply. In fact, courts have repeatedly held that even undercover officers or jailhouse informants can sometimes obtain statements without triggering the Miranda protections. The reasoning behind that is Miranda was designed to protect suspects from coercive pressure of a police-dominated interrogation environment. A conversation with someone the suspect believes is just another private individual does not necessarily create that same kind of atmosphere. And that's where Dennis Benjamin becomes legally important, because the only way the structure of this situation survives constitutional scrutiny is if Benjamin is treated strictly as a private citizen. If he is just a retired police officer acting completely on his own, having conversations with Dylan Adams inside his home or at the local McDonald's or wherever the hell at, then those conversations fall well outside of Miranda entirely. In that scenario, the only interrogation that legally matters is the one conducted later by TBI agents. After Dylan Adams was read his Miranda rights and the interview was formally recorded. But there is another legal doctrine that really complicates this picture: the doctrine of state agents. Courts have long held that law enforcement cannot bypass constitutional protections simply by using private individuals to do their work for them. If a private person is effectively acting on behalf of investigators, if there is an understanding that they will obtain statements, gather information, or help build a case, then that person can legally be treated as an agent of the state. And if that happens, then the constitutional analysis changes, because the government cannot circumvent Miranda or due process protections simply by inserting a middleman. Now, let's be clear. Appellate courts reviewing the Holly Bobo case have not squarely ruled that Dennis Benjamin was a state agent whose involvement made Dylan Adams' statements unconstitutional. The courts focused on other legal issues raised in the appeals and ultimately upheld the conviction. So, in the eyes of the law, at least for now, this arrangement survives in a kind of gray area. Not necessarily endorsed, but not declared unconstitutional either, mainly because the courts have not looked at this. And I don't know where they would come down. I find it questionable as hell, but who the hell am I? But that's why the distinction matters so much, because if Dennis Benjamin was truly a private citizen, then his conversations with Dylan Adams exist outside of Miranda entirely. But if he was functioning as an agent of investigators, then the legal analysis looks very different. And that is the question that we're going to examine next. Now remember, the entire legal structure that allows this situation to stand depends on Dennis Benjamin being treated as a private citizen. That's the key distinction. If Benjamin is just a retired cop helping a family and talking to people on his own initiative, then the constitutional protections around interrogation are much narrower. Miranda does not apply to private conversations, and statements made to a private individual generally remain admissible. But when you start looking at how Benjamin actually presented himself to people connected to the case, that private citizen label becomes a hell of a lot harder to reconcile. Because in several situations, Benjamin did not behave like a neutral civilian observer. He behaved like someone with knowledge of the criminal exposure witnesses were facing and influence over what might happen to them. One of the clearest examples comes from a recorded conversation Benjamin had with Victor Densmore in 2014 at Densmore's home in Indiana. Now, during that meeting, Benjamin told Densmore that there were 8 charges hanging over him and suggested that 3 of them could carry the death penalty. And at one point, he told him bluntly that if he couldn't produce Holly Bobo's body, he was, quote, effed. He also pressed Dinsmore about which of the suspects might be the, quote, weak link in the group. Dinsmore's answer was Dylan Adams. He described Dylan as fragile, weak, someone who could easily be pressured. Now, that conversation raises an obvious question. How exactly does a, quote, private citizen walk into someone's home and start discussing the number of criminal charges that they might face, the possibility of the death penalty, and the strategic vulnerabilities among suspects in a homicide investigation that he apparently has nothing to do with? That kind of discussion normally comes from prosecutors, investigators, or defense attorneys, people who actually operate inside the criminal justice system. But Benjamin also appeared to position himself as someone connected to the broader investigative machinery around the case. Post-conviction filings allege that Benjamin suggested that Dinsmore could receive reward money tied to information in the case, and various accounts of the investigation describe him presenting himself as someone who had relationships with TBI agents, with the prosecutors in the case, and with federal authorities. In other words, when Benjamin was talking to witnesses or potential suspects, he sometimes spoke as if he had insider knowledge and influence. Yet, when the legality of Dylan Adams' statements comes under scrutiny, that characterization shifts. Now, all of a sudden, Benjamin is described as a private citizen simply talking to someone in his home with no official authority whatsoever and no law enforcement role. That dual posture creates a tension in the record because, on one hand, Benjamin could present himself to witnesses as someone who understood their legal exposure and had access to investigators. But then on the other hand, when constitutional protections become relevant, well, then the argument becomes that he was simply a retired cop acting independently. And that distinction matters enormously because if Benjamin was truly just a private citizen, then the conversations that occurred while Dylan Adams was living in his home exist outside the normal constitutional safeguards surrounding interrogation. But if he was functioning, even informally, as an extension of the investigative effort, then the legal analysis becomes far more complicated. Now, while Dennis Benjamin was becoming more and more embedded into the narrative that ultimately led to the confessions and the prosecutions in this case, something else was happening inside the investigation itself, because not everyone working the Holly Bobo case agreed with the direction that it was going. Two figures in particular stand out: TBI agent Terry Dicus and United States Marshal John Walker. Both men were involved in the investigation relatively early. Both were experienced investigators, and both reached the same conclusion about the likely suspect in Holly Bobo's abduction. They believed the evidence pointed towards a man named Terry Britt. Dicus was the original lead case agent for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. In the early stages of the case, he focused heavily on Britt because of several factors, including Britt's prior history as a serial rapist, reports of stalking behavior, inconsistencies in his alibi, and cell phone activity that raised investigative questions. Dicus also examined cell tower data connected to the timeline. We've talked about this in the previous episode, and how those records did not place Zach Adams where prosecutors would eventually claim he was. Now, because of that, Dicus continued to pursue Britt as the primary suspect. But over time, the direction of the investigation began shifting away from Britt and toward the group that would eventually be charged: Zach and Dylan Adams, Shane Austin, and Jason Autry. And once that pivot happened, Terry Dicus was no longer the lead agent. By the time the case went to trial in 2017, Dicus was no longer with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation at all. Instead, he appeared as a witness explaining that he had been criticized internally for having tunnel vision on Terry Britt, but Dicus wasn't the only investigator who reached that conclusion. U.S. Marshal John Walker was brought into the case early to assist with searches and analysis of cell phone and tower data. Walker later said that the information he and other federal partners examined pointed towards the same suspect that Dicus had identified, Terry Britt. Walker also stated publicly that he and others provided maps, reports, and analysis supporting that theory. But once the investigative focus shifted toward Adams and the Autry group, Walker says those leads were just no longer pursued. And like Dicus, Walker eventually found himself outside the core investigative circle. Later accounts of the case note that multiple investigators who favored the Britt theory, including Dicus, Walker, FBI agent Art Viveros, were effectively removed or sidelined as the prosecution's narrative began to solidify around a different group of suspects. Now, that does not automatically mean that the later theory was wrong. Investigations change direction all the time as new information emerges, becomes available, witnesses open up, whatever. But what it does show is that there was a significant split inside the investigative team. On one side were investigators who continued to believe that Terry Britt was most likely the offender. And on the other side were those building the case that would eventually lead to the arrests and conviction of Zach Adams and the others. And as this divide deepened, the investigators pushing the Britt theory increasingly found themselves pushed out of the center of the investigation, out of the TBI in general. And that context matters because while some figures were being marginalized for refusing to move away from Britt, others, like Dennis Benjamin, were becoming more deeply integrated into the investigative narrative that would ultimately drive the case forward. Now let's come back to the confession itself, because the timeline leading up to Dylan Adams' statements is remarkably short and structured in a way that raises some important questions. After resolving the federal gun case, Dylan Adams was released from custody on the condition that he live with Dennis Benjamin. Remember, these two men had never met before. And Benjamin, at this point, was already closely connected to the Bobo family and communicating with investigators about this case. So from all that I was able to find, Dylan spends roughly 5 or 6 weeks living in Benjamin's home. When we don't have recordings of their conversations during this time, we don't know what exactly was discussed day to day, but what we do know happens at the end of that period. After those weeks pass, Dennis Benjamin contacts authorities and reports that he has someone in his home who wants to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo. The following day, September 17, 2014, Benjamin personally transports Dylan to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation office in Jackson. And according to later reconstructions of the interrogation process, something important happens before Dylan ever speaks on camera. Benjamin meets privately with the investigators. During that conversation, he apparently describes what he says Dylan has already told him about Holly Bobo's murder. He presents this account using handwritten notes rather than any audio recording of Dylan actually saying those things. So the very first version of the confession that investigators hear does not come directly from Dylan Adams. It comes from Dennis Benjamin. Only after that off-camera briefing do agents bring Dylan Adams in, read him his Miranda rights, and begin the recorded interview. From that point forward, the confession becomes part of the official record. And in that recorded statement, Dylan Adams tells investigators a story that dramatically reshapes the case. He claims that Holly Bobo had been taken to Zach Adams' house. Jason Autry's there. Zach Adams obviously is there, depending on which version. Shane Austin shows up, and Dylan implicates himself, saying that he participated in the sexual assault with the others. For prosecutors, this narrative was enormously significant. Up to that moment, investigators did not have a statement placing Holly Bobo inside Zach Adams' home. They did not have a witness directly describing a group of men assaulting her. Dylan Adams' confession suddenly provided that story, and once the story existed, it became the foundation for the arrest and the prosecutions that followed. Dylan Adams' confession suddenly provided that story. But really the important thing at this particular point is a defendant connected to the investigation was somehow released to federal custody, placed in the home of a retired cop who's working for the Bobos, lives there for 5 weeks or so, and then decides to confess in full to all of this. And before we sit down with Dylan Adams and we talk about what he actually says in that recorded interview, we need to pause again and talk about something that becomes very clear once you watch it. And let me be clear. You can really only see TBI officer Jeff Jackson and Dylan Adams in the video. It's hard to know who in there is saying what, where all the questions are coming from. It's very confusing when you watch it. But we do know that somehow Dennis Benjamin is participating in this. And that's extraordinarily unusual. Modern law enforcement interrogation training is actually very clear about how interviews like this are supposed to be conducted. In most situations, investigators are taught that interviews, especially custodial interrogations, should be conducted one-on-one. One investigator, one suspect. The reason for that structure is simple. Investigators are supposed to maintain complete control of the interview environment. It protects the integrity of the statement. It reduces the risk of coercion claims, and it prevents other people from influencing the suspect's answers. Training materials that are used in law enforcement, including the widely taught Reed interrogation framework, specifically warn against having unnecessary third parties involved in questioning. In the rare situations where someone else is allowed to be present, it is usually because the law requires it. It might be a defense attorney. It might be a parent if the suspect is a juvenile. Sometimes it's an interpreter, but even then, those individuals are supposed to observe, not participate. Investigators are actually instructed that if a third party begins interfering with the interview or influencing the suspect's answers, the interview should be paused and that person should be removed from the room. Because once someone else starts shaping the conversation, then the reliability of the statement can become questionable. Now, compare that standard practice to what happens here. Dennis Benjamin is not Dylan Adams' attorney. He's not a parent, he's not a guardian, and he's not an advocate for Dylan. And he's not even active law enforcement. Instead, he is a retired police officer who has inserted himself into the investigation through the Bobo family, and he'd been living with Dylan Adams for several weeks before the confession. Yet during the interrogation process, Benjamin is not simply observing. He asks questions. He interjects shit. And some of the shit in this whole confession are striking. At various points, weird, sick questions come out that I struggle to find the relevance for the investigation. We'll talk about it when we get to these places. But, I mean, it's stuff like, did you ejaculate in her? Why did Zach Adams let you go second? These are not casual comments, and they're just extraordinarily rare. Like I said, some of these, I can't tell who exactly they're coming from. I don't know if Benjamin is necessarily injecting himself in here or not. I just find so many problems with this confession. Now, before we dive into it, let's go ahead and set the scene, because the physical setup of the room actually looks fairly typical for a law enforcement interview. Inside the interrogation room, sitting at the table with Dylan Adams, are 2 Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents. Special Agent Jeff Jackson is the primary interviewer, and he is the one that you can see on camera. Also present in the room is Special Agent Brent Booth, although Booth pretty much stays off the camera for the whole thing. Like I said, you see Jeff Jackson, you don't see Brent Booth. And then behind the one-way glass are additional observers. Who the shit even knows who all's in there? Dennis Benjamin's in there, other TBI personnel. So on paper, the structure of the interrogation room looks fairly standard. Investigators at the table, observers behind the glass. And At least at the beginning, the interview itself starts in a pretty routine way. The recording begins with the agents confirming the date and time, September the 17th, 2014. Jeff Jackson identifies himself and the others present for the record, and Dylan Adams is seated across the table from him. Then Jackson explains why they're there, not because Dylan has been arrested, but because Dylan, through Dennis Benjamin, has come forward with some new information. Jackson says that he spoke with Benjamin beforehand and that Benjamin told him Dylan has shared things that went beyond anything that he had previously told investigators. Now from there, Jackson does what investigators are trained to do before asking any substantive questions, and that is he reads Dylan Adams his Miranda rights. He explains that Dylan has the right to remain silent, that anything he say can be used, that he has the right to consult an attorney before questioning, and that if he cannot afford one will be provided, all of the things that we all know, and Dylan signs the waiver. And once that formality is complete, Jeff Jackson asks the question that opens the interview. He says that he already understands the, quote, gist of what Dylan told Dennis Benjamin, but now he wants Dylan to explain it himself. So he asked him to start at the beginning, to go back to the day before everything happened. And that's where Dylan Adams begins telling a story that will become the backbone of the prosecution's case. Almost immediately, Dennis Benjamin's role enters the conversation. Just a few minutes into the recording, around the 3.5 minute mark, Jackson says something that's easy to miss if you're not listening closely. He tells Dylan, quote, Dennis said that you was a little bit upset that you had not told me everything way back when, end quote. So right away, the framing of this interview is tied to something Dylan supposedly told Dennis. Jackson then reassures Dylan that he's not angry and that Dylan is doing the right thing by coming forward now, and then he asks him to start from the beginning. Specifically, the night before Holly Bobo disappeared.
Let's back up to the day before all this happened. And don't leave any detail of any kind out. Okay, let's just start from right there. And you walk me through everything. Don't get hung up. You know, Dennis said that you was a little bit upset that you had not told me everything way back when. I'm not messed up about it, okay? You're doing the right thing now about coming forward about it. It's, you know, I'm not mad at you. It'll never be any different than the first time I ever talked to you. I'm not going to raise my voice or anything like that. I'm not mad at you. I'm very glad that you're doing the right thing and coming forward. Okay. So let's just go ahead and start with what happened. How did all y'all get together the night before this happened?
So Dylan begins describing what he says happened the night before April 13th. He says he was at Zach's house. He says Jason Autry came over. And according to Dylan, the group spent the evening doing drugs together. And then he says that Autry and the others left around midnight or maybe 1 a.m. So here's Dylan explaining that in his own words.
I was at Zach's. Autry come up one night. We done out, we gunned out, and they ended up leaving. I mean, they left about 1 o'clock, and I did not see them. Did not have no knowledge of what they was doing till they come back.
Now, on its face, that sounds like the beginning of a narrative, but there's a problem, and it's a problem that shows up almost immediately because Dylan's own cell phone activity places him somewhere else. The available phone data for Dylan Adams is extremely limited. There's only a handful of tower connections that I was able to find, but 2 of those pings are very important. One of them at 12:06 a.m. and another one at 12:51 a.m. Dylan's phone connects to the Birdsong Tower, specifically Sector 7, the east-facing sector. And for those of you that have watched the video or listened to my previous podcasts on the cell phone stuff, that's a ways away from Dylan's house. That tower coverage area is roughly 13 to 14 miles away from Adams' house, near the Tennessee River. So, in other words, according to the tower data, Dylan's phone was not at Zach's house during the time that he says he was there. His phone was across the freaking river valley. And after that second ping at 12:51 a.m., his phone, as near as I can find, goes quiet for hours, not showing activity until 11:16 a.m. when it appears at the Parsons Tower. Now, we already walked through the cell phone evidence in detail in the previous episode, so I'm not going to relitigate that entire analysis here, but it's worth pausing on one point. We are less than 5 minutes into Dylan Adams' confession, and already the story that he's telling investigators does not line up with the physical evidence that we have. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean Dylan is lying. Phones can be left behind, people can travel without them, but it does mean something important. Before the confession has even really begun, the timeline that Dylan is describing is already in conflict with the objective data. Now, I'm not going to walk through every single minute of this interview. For one thing, it's freaking over 4 hours long. And for another, what you're hearing here is based on my own listening of the interrogation. It's not the official court certified transcript. So it's best used as a general guide to conversation rather than a word for word legal document. But I have faith that it's an actual recording of the conversation. I believe that it is complete. With that being said, I would not enter it into evidence. But the structure of the questioning in the early part of the interview is pretty clear. Jeff Jackson begins drilling down into details about the night before Holly disappeared. He asked Dylan what kinds of drugs they were using. Dylan says they were doing ice, methamphetamines. Jackson asks where it came from. Dylan says Jason Autry brought it. Then Jackson starts working through the kind of granular details that investigators often focus on in interviews. What was Autry wearing? What was Zach wearing? What vehicle did Autry arrive in? Were they smoking the meth or injecting it? Now, this is interesting because Dylan says they were shooting it and that everyone had their own rig. So for those of you that don't know, that means they're injecting it intravenously. And there's a setup of syringes and needles and spoons and all of that that's required in order to do that. So when he says everyone has their own rig, it means everyone has their own shit for doing that. Their own needles, their own spoons, their own everything. So Jackson continues pressing for specifics. What time did Autry arrive? Dylan estimates sometime around 7 or 8 that evening, saying that it was already dark. Then the questioning shifts towards what they were talking about while they were using drugs. Jackson tells Dylan that this should be one of the most memorable periods of his life, a traumatic few days that would stick permanently in his mind, and encourages him to recall every detail that he possibly can. And so that's the tone of the interview at this stage. Jackson is trying to lock down specifics, times, clothing, vehicles, conversations, the kind of details investigators often use to test whether someone is recalling an actual memory or constructing a story. But as we've already seen with the cell phone data, even some of the earliest pieces of Dylan's timeline are difficult to reconcile with the objective evidence. As the interview continues, something else starts to happen. The questions begin shifting from gathering information to suggesting a narrative. Around the 8-minute mark, Jeff Jackson starts describing a scenario that Dylan himself is not actually laid out. Jackson tells him that there must have been a discussion the night before about what was going to happen. Who chose Holly? Why Holly? Which of them thought that she was attractive? Which one of them knew her the most? And then Jackson says something that's very important to notice. He tells Dylan that the plan to go get her had to have been discussed while they were sitting there doing drugs, and he presses him to explain what conversation led to that decision. But when Dylan responds, he does not confirm that story. He says he has no clue. He says they were talking about going to get somebody, not Holly specifically, just somebody. And then the questioning takes another step. Jackson begins asking how often this group would go out and get someone to rape.
What was the discussion that led up to choosing her and going to get her?
That I have no clue. They were talking about going to get somebody. I mean,
Talking about finding someone to rape. How often do they go get somebody to rape?
that I don't know.
How many different times have you ever been involved with them and having a conversation, or how many other people do you know of that's ever been raped?
Now, think about that framing for a moment. The premise of the question assumes that this is something that the group has done before, that there was some pattern of men sitting around using drugs and then going out to kidnap and rape women. But the problem with that idea becomes obvious when you look at the context of where this case actually takes place. This is not a large metropolitan area where people can disappear anonymously. This is rural Tennessee. Holiday, the community where Zach Adams lived, has fewer than 100 residents. Parsons, the nearest town of any real size, has a population of roughly 2,000. Within a 5-mile radius of Zach Adams' house, you're talking about maybe 1,600 people total. In a community that small, the idea that a group of men had been routinely kidnapping and raping women would not stay hidden. People would know. Rumors would spread. There would be victims. There'd be police reports. There'd be families demanding answers. Small towns don't keep secrets like that for long. So when you hear that line of questioning, suggesting this might have been something that the group had done repeatedly, it raises a different kind of question. Not about what Dylan Adams is confessing to, but about the story that the interviewer seems to be building as the interview unfolds. As we continue, another pattern emerges. Dylan repeatedly places himself outside of the planning. According to his account, the group sits around using meth the night before Holly disappears. They talk vaguely about going to get someone. And then Dylan says Zach and Jason leave sometime between midnight and 1 in the morning. And after that point, Dylan claims that he has no idea what happens. He says he doesn't see him again until the next morning around 9:30 or 10. So, according to Dylan's own version of events, the key planning and execution window, the time when Holly would actually be abducted, happens when he's not there. And that's important because when someone gives a genuine confession, especially in serious crimes, they typically don't minimize their own involvement to this extent. They may shift blame, they may rationalize, but if someone is truly confessing to participating in a crime, investigators expect them to actually have been there, to describe what they themselves actually did. Instead, what we're hearing here in this part of the confession is Dylan repeatedly describing what other people did. He places the planning outside his presence. He places the critical timeline outside his presence. And that's something that investigators are usually trained to treat as a potential red flag. Then the interview takes another strange turn. Jackson begins pressing Dylan about who knew Holly and who thought she was attractive.
How does Jason know Holly?
I have no clue about that either.
How do you know Holly?
I seen her one time at Miss Ruby. I was with Brent Hornett. As we was leaving, she pulled up, and I asked Brent who she was, and he told me who she was, and we left.
You make any comment about her being a pretty girl, or?
I said she's a pretty looking girl. I mean, she was born in Decatur County. That's all I said.
This part's weird as shit to me. Dylan says that he barely knew her at all. He says that he had only seen her once when she pulled up somewhere while he was with someone named Brent Barnett or some shit like that. Dylan's very hard to understand in this interview. Now, according to Dylan, he asked who she was, and the only comment that he remembers making about her was that she was a pretty girl. That's it. But we'll listen to it. We'll notice how the detail enters the interview. The investigators are asking about who thought she was pretty, as though that question somehow helps explain why Holly was targeted, which is a very unusual line of reasoning because, again, we're talking about a tiny rural community. Holly Bobo wasn't some anonymous stranger. She was a well-known young woman from a prominent local family. She was very attractive. She was an attractive girl. And so the idea that a male, finding her attractive somehow means that he's going to rape and murder her, it's mind-blowing. Anyway, the idea that a group of men would just randomly decide to abduct and assault her simply because someone thought that she was attractive raises some freaking obvious questions. And at this point in the interview, we're still hearing a story that doesn't line up cleanly with the timeline. It does not place Dylan in the planning, and increasingly seems to be shaped by the questions being asked rather than by any kind of memories that Dylan is volunteering on his own. Now, this next section of the interview raises several red flags. First, Dylan's statements about Holly being a pretty-looking girl gets immediately expanded by the investigator into something much bigger. Dylan says he saw Holly once and made a casual comment that she was pretty. That's it. But within seconds, the questioning reframes that into something else entirely. The investigator is trying to establish a motive, some explanation for why Holly would have been targeted in the first place. But again, that idea is not coming from Dylan. It's being told to him. Then the pressure shifts to another theme that appears repeatedly throughout this interview: avoiding conflicts in the story. The investigator tells Dylan that sooner or later the other suspects are going to talk. His brother will talk. Autry will talk. Shane will talk. Other people will talk. And the key thing that the investigator says he doesn't want is any discrepancies. In other words, the focus here is not just on what Dylan remembers. It is not to get Dylan's story of what happened. It is on making sure that his version aligns with what investigators believe the story to be.
I just want to know, because here's what I don't want to happen. I don't want any conflict in the story. Sooner or later, your brother's going to talk to me. Sooner or later, Autry's going to talk to me, and who knows who else. When they talk to me, I don't want there to be a discrepancy about whether or not you knew and whether or not her name has been said.
And then questioning moves into a whole new area, the cell phones. And this is where the timeline problems become impossible to ignore. Dylan maintains that after Zach and Jason leave, sometime between midnight and 1 o'clock in the morning, he stays at the house alone. He watches some TV, he plays some pool, and he waits around until they return in the morning. And according to Dylan, they come back somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock. When they arrive, he claims that they have Holly in the truck. But the cell phone records for Zach Adams and Jason Autry paint a very different picture of what's happening that morning. Early in the morning, before Holly disappears, Zach's phone is quiet after about 5 o'clock. Jason Autry's phone, however, is active far north in Camden, Tennessee, well away from Zach's house, totally the opposite direction of Holly's. But then, after Holly is abducted around 7:45 to 8 a.m., both phones begin showing activity near Zach's home tower. The two men are communicating repeatedly, calls, texts, back and forth. Then around 9:40 in the morning, both phones suddenly appear on the Birdsong Tower, the same place that Dylan was at 12 and 1 o'clock that morning. Now they're back out there because, according to Zach, that's where they would go to do drugs, which seems like a pretty freaking logical explanation why these druggies keep ending up out on the Tennessee River. From about 10:03 to 10:32, Zach's phone enters a burst of rapid communications, multiple calls, multiple texts, while still on that Birdsong Tower near the river. Then shortly after that, Both phones move away from the river and back towards the home tower area. At 11:16, Zach's phone is hitting the Parsons Tower, where surveillance video captures a truck matching Dylan Adams' Silverado pulling into an ATM. So when you compare Dylan's story to the objective data, a few things stand out immediately. According to Dylan, Zach and Jason return with Holly sometime around 9:30 or 10.
What time do they come back?
It's 9:30, 10 that morning.
The morning that Holly was taken, they show back up with Holly in your truck at about what time?
9:30, 10.
9:30 to 10. I'm just making sure we're all on the same page.
Cell phone records show both men's phones near the Birdsong Tower by the river near that same window of time, and then moving away from it shortly afterwards. In other words, the timeline that Dylan describes doesn't line up cleanly with the digital trail that those phones leave behind. And that's a pattern that we've now seen several times. The narrative Dylan is describing doesn't consistently match the physical evidence, which raises an important question as we continue through this. Is Dylan actually recounting events that he personally experienced? Or is he trying to piece together a story that fits the expectations being presented to him in the room? So before we go any further with Dylan's story, we have to stop and put the actual evidence timeline back on the table, because once you do that, the problems with this confession become impossible to ignore. So let's start with Holly Bobo's phone. Between 7:30 a.m. and 8:11 a.m., Holly's phone is doing exactly what you would expect it to do if she was still at home. It connects repeatedly to towers that historically serve the area around her residence in Darden. 7:30, 7:31, 7:40, her phone hits the Chesterfield Tower. 7:33 hits the Scotts Hill Tower. Then her phone connects to the Decatur Tower, the Parsons Tower, then back to the Chesterfield Tower. The pattern is exactly what you see when someone is stationary inside their normal coverage area. There's no indication that Holly's phone has left the house yet, and then something changes. After 8:11, Holly's phone begins moving north. At 8:17 and 8:26, it hits the Shiloh Road Tower. That tower covers the remote wooded area where Holly's remains were eventually discovered. Then the phone goes quiet. For about 30 minutes, there's no communication activity, but investigators begin actively pinging the phone. Those pings show it sitting stationary in that Shiloh Road sector, exactly where Holly's remains would later be found. Then at 9:06 a.m., the phone starts moving again. It transitions towards the truck stop tower near Zach Adams' home, but on the western facing tower instead of the southern facing tower. At 9:10, her phone is still in that same area, and then at 9:25, it makes its final network connection. It also still in that same area. So the location aligns with the Club Creek and Gooch Creek area where her remains were later recovered. Now, immediately after that final ping, the phone goes completely dead. Investigators believe the battery's been removed at this point, the pieces thrown into a creek along with her belongings. So that is the objective timeline based on Holly's phone. So now compare that to what Dylan Adams is describing in his interview. According to Dylan, Zach and Jason leave around midnight, and he stays at the house where he watches TV and plays pool, and then sometime around 9:30 or 10 o'clock that morning, they return with Holly, who's already beaten and injured, but by 9:25, Holly's phone is already destroyed and thrown into a creek miles away. Which means the crime sequence that Dylan is describing would have had to happen before that time. Yet, the story places Holly arriving at the house after that. So, once again, we're left with the same problem. The confession timeline does not match the physical evidence. And that is not a minor discrepancy. It's a structural problem with the entire story. But before we go any further, I just got to give a brief warning. The next portion of Dylan Adams' statement, and quite a bit actually from here on out, contains descriptions of sexual assault. We're not going to sensationalize it, and I'm not going to repeat every graphic detail from the interview, but in order to evaluate his confession honestly, we do have to talk about what Dylan claims happened inside that house. So if you're listening with children nearby, or if descriptions of sexual violence are something that you'd prefer not to hear, this would be a good moment for you to skip ahead. For everyone else, what you're about to hear is part of the recorded interview where investigators begin asking Dylan about alleged assault of Holly Bobo. And as you listen, pay close attention not just to what Dylan says, but also how the story is being developed inside the room. As the interview moves forward, Dylan begins describing the moment when Zach and Jason supposedly returned to the house with Holly. Now, according to Dylan, Zach pulls into the carport.
Okay.
Then Zach gets out, opens the door, gets her out, also gets out.
Okay.
And then they start going in the house.
Where did they pull up to?
They pulled up to the carport.
To it, or in it, or beside it, or
To
what?
the carport right there by the front.
And he is driving Dylan's truck. They get Holly out of the truck. She's injured slightly. He describes a swollen nose, a black eye, a cut lip. He says that she's bleeding a little bit as she's led into the house, but nothing more than like a cut on the lip. Now, there's something important that we need to pause on here, because investigators at Holly Bobo's home found a significant pool of blood in the carport, and I've shown pictures of it. You know, it's a significant pool of blood. It's not a drop, it's not a smear, it's a pool of blood. The kind of blood evidence that suggests a more serious injury occurred at that location than a cut on the lip.
You said you remember the shirt. Has she been hurt? Did you see any injuries to her?
She looked like she'd been bleeding right here. She had total blood. Her eye looked like it was black, nose swollen a little bit.
Okay.
And maybe even a little cut right there on her lip.
You remember it being on that side of her face?
Right there.
So it's over here. This eye looks puffy, and your nose.
And it looked tough on that swollen.
Did you see any blood coming out of her mouth or nose or anything? You just say you saw
a
it?
little bit, yeah.
Okay.
And now there's your black eye, busted lip.
Okay.
And there's some blood right here on her shirt.
Now, that's very different from what Dylan is describing. Sounds more like some minor facial injuries, a bruised lip, a swollen nose. Those injuries don't normally produce the kind of blood that investigators documented at Holly's house. So right away, the physical evidence in Dylan's description are a little difficult to reconcile, but what happens next in the interview is even stranger, because instead of focusing on the sequence of the crime, what happened to Holly, who did what Dylan himself did, the investigators begin spending an odd and extraordinary amount of time discussing a couch. Not the assault, not the abduction, the couch.
Now, the way that house is laid out, that couch was sitting, if it was the same way then as it was when I saw it, that couch was kind of sitting with one end close to that window and one end further away from the window. Does that sound right? Or was it sitting?
It was, at that time, it was right there, even with the little bar right there.
Okay, so maybe it'll help us if we draw that. You think? Let's take this and draw.
They begin asking Dylan exactly where this couch was located in the living room. They start drawing diagrams. They debate whether the couch was positioned near the window or near the bar or facing the kitchen. They ask what color the couch was, how it was oriented in the room, whether it was leather, whether it was green. They redraw the diagram multiple times, and the investigator even says something that's very revealing. He says, quote, "It's important to me where exactly this couch was positioned," end quote.
Before we're done today, I think I have someone in this group can find me a diagram of that. house as it was, the way that when we were there. So I'll try to find that for us before we're done, because it's important to me where exactly this couch was positioned and all that now, okay? But
Now, think about the premise of this interview. According to investigators, this is supposed to be a confession. This is the moment where Dylan Adams is finally telling them what happened after all these years. So, if the officers are truly learning the story for the first time, then why is the location of this couch suddenly one of the most important details in the room? Why not the kitchen table? Why not the bedroom? Why not the carport? Why the couch? Because the amount of time spent establishing the exact position of this piece of furniture is quite extraordinary. Minutes go by, it comes up multiple times in the interview. Diagrams are drawn, and not only are diagrams drawn, at a later point they actually leave the room to get official diagrams of Zach Adams' house. Corrections are made. And they even mention that someone might be able to retrieve an official diagram. All of this is happening before the interview even gets into the alleged assault itself. In a normal confession, investigators are trying to establish the sequence of the crime. Who did what? When did it happen? Where did it happen? But here, the interrogation pauses while everyone in the room works together to reconstruct the geometry of a living room couch, which raises a question. If investigators truly did not know the story yet, then why was the position of that couch already so important? So let's stop again and walk through the timeline using Dylan's own version of events. According to him, Zach and Jason arrived back at the house with Holly sometime between 9:30 and 10 o'clock in the morning. So let's just assume it's the earliest possible time, which it couldn't be, but let's assume that it is. 9:30 a.m. they pull into the carport. They get Holly out of the truck. They lead her inside the house. They walk her past the pool table. They walk her through the house into the living room. That alone would take a few minutes. So now we're roughly, 9:35? And then Dylan says the assault begins. According to him, Zach bends Holly over the couch and he rapes her. Dylan estimates that lasts for 4 to 5 minutes. Even if we take that estimate at face value and allow almost no time for the logistics of removing clothing and positioning her, the earliest we could reasonably place the end of that assault would be around 9:40, but more realistically, you're probably looking closer to 9:45 or 9:50. So this is where we have to pause again, because the dynamics that Dylan describes during this assault are extremely unusual. Not impossible, but very uncommon. In Dylan's story, Jason Autry is the one controlling Holly. He's the one that leads her into the house. He's the one that removes her clothing. In other words, Autry is functioning as the dominant actor in the room. Yet, according to Dylan, Autry then allows Zach to assault her first. That is not how most violent sexual offenders behave at all. Criminal profiling research and offender interviews consistently show that offenders who assert control during an assault, the person directing the victim, restraining the victim, controlling the environment, they are the primary offender. Usually, they don't have anybody else at all. They certainly don't typically hand off the first assault to someone else. Now, what Dylan is describing is a scenario where the person who appears to be running the situation suddenly steps aside and lets someone else go first. It's not impossible, but it is highly atypical. And it gets even stranger because when investigators press Dylan about the timing of the assault, he admits he's not actually measuring anything. He wasn't watching a clock. He's just estimating, which means the timeline that he's describing is essentially guesswork. And that matters a lot because by the time we reach 9:40 to 9:50 in Dylan's version of events, the cell phone evidence shows something very different happening. Zach Adams' phone is already on the birdsong tower. So once again, we're left with the same problem we've seen throughout. The story being told in the room does not line up cleanly with the timeline that's established by the physical evidence. Now this clip comes from roughly 33 minutes or so into the confession.
How did he hold her against that couch?
He bent her over, and held her arms out, pressed her down over her so she couldn't get away.
Over the end of the couch.
Yes.
So by Dylan's own timeline, the assault would still be happening at the exact moment that Zach Adams' phone is already moving towards the river. As the interview continues, the questioning becomes increasingly graphic. Investigators begin asking Dylan detailed questions about ejaculation, which is weird as shit. They ask whether it happened inside her or on her. They ask whether a condom was used. They ask whether blood got on Dylan's clothing. Now, remember something very important. By the time this interrogation is taking place in September of 2014, Holly Bobo's remains have already been discovered earlier that year. And those remains were skeletal, which means there was no recoverable biological evidence from the body indicating semen. There was no forensic evidence showing ejaculation, no DNA evidence of semen recovered from the remains. So this line of questioning is not designed to confirm forensic evidence, and it's not designed to obtain details that could later be verified by forensic evidence, which raises a serious question. Why spend so much time pressing for details about ejaculation when investigators already knew that no such evidence existed? Because normally when investigators question a suspect about sexual assault, those kind of questions are tied directly to forensic corroboration. Did the suspect ejaculate? Was a condom used? Where did it occur? Those questions matter when investigators expect to recover DNA evidence that can either confirm or contradict the statement, but here that possibility didn't exist. Like I said, the remains were skeletal. There was no biological evidence to confirm any of these claims. And that brings us to another major problem. According to Dylan's own timeline, his assault on Holly lasted 20 minutes. So let's go back to the clock again. If the group arrived at the house at 9:30, the first assault begins shortly thereafter. Zach's assault ends somewhere around 9:40 to 9:50. Dylan claims that he assaults Holly for another 20 minutes, which now pushes us to the 10 o'clock to 10:15 range. But remember what the phone evidence shows, because around that same period, Zach Adams' phone is already on the birdsong tower near the Tennessee River. So in other words, when Dylan's story places everyone inside the house committing a prolonged assault, the cell phone data places the primary suspect miles away near the river. And then there's the biggest forensic issue of all. Multiple search warrants were executed on Zach Adams' property. Investigators searched the house extensively, and according to Dylan's account, this assault involved a severely beaten victim, multiple sexual assaults, significant bleeding, and extended physical contact inside that living room. Yet, despite those claims, investigators recovered exactly zero forensic evidence placing Holly Bobo inside that house. No blood, no hair, no fibers, no DNA, nothing. And when investigators asked Dylan about cleanup, he says he has no idea if anything was ever cleaned. So we're left with a scenario where a violent sexual assault supposedly occurred inside a house involving heavy bleeding, multiple attackers, and prolonged physical contact, yet repeated searches of that location produced no forensic evidence that Holly Bobo had ever even been there. If this assault happened the way that Dylan is describing it, there should have been forensic evidence everywhere in that house. Instead, investigators found nothing tying Holly Bobo to Zach Adams' home. Not a drop of blood, not a strand of hair, not a single piece of DNA.
Exactly how did you rape her? How did you her? Which one did you do first? Did you use a condom or anything?
Good office.
Yes. Did you finish inside her? On her? How'd you finish? The floor. How much blood was on the floor? How bad was she bleeding? More like this. Is that a wood floor in that part? Yes. What was ever done to clean that up? Well, I know just that. After I don't know. You don't know if he ever came back and used any kind of bleach, or did he ever make you do any cleaning up?
So at this part of the interview, the audio becomes really difficult to follow. There's overlapping voices. Parts of Dylan's responses are barely audible. He talks very low and he's very hard to understand. Some sections are simply impossible to make out with any kind of certainty, but even when the words are hard to hear, the interrogation dynamic itself is very clear. And that dynamic follows a pattern that researchers in false confessions have documented for decades. First comes encouragement and praise. Investigators repeatedly tell Dylan that he's doing the right thing and they thank him for cooperating. They tell him that they appreciate him, quote, being a man about it. That kind of reinforcement is very common in confession-driven interrogations. It signals to the suspect that confessing is the correct path forward, but almost immediately after that praise, the tone shifts. Now the investigators introduce pressure. They warn Dylan that they are going to talk to Zach. They're going to talk to Jason. And they make it very clear that they expect everyone's stories to match. One investigator says something extremely telling. Quote, I don't want any difference at all in anything that's said. End quote. That statement reveals the goal of the moment. Not to discover any new information, but to lock the story into a consistent narrative. And then the tone shifts again. The investigator moves back into reinsurance. He tells Dylan he appreciates him telling the truth. He says it's a big step. He says he's grateful. And then the pressure returns. Questions are raised about whether Dylan knew the plan beforehand, whether the others might say he was involved from the beginning, whether he's left anything out. This cycle repeats several times in just a few minutes. Praise, pressure, reassurance, threat of contradiction, praise again. That pattern is sometimes described in interrogation training as a rapport pressure cycle, and it's particularly effective when used against suspects who are vulnerable, young suspects, suspects with low cognitive functioning, or suspects who are highly suggestible, eager to please authority figures. Those individuals often respond to the emotional cues of the interviewer rather than the factual content of the questions. They try to maintain approval and avoid the moment when the interviewer withdraws that approval, which is exactly what we see happening here, because every time Dylan moves closer to the version of events that the investigators appear to expect, the tone becomes supportive again. But when uncertainty appears, the pressure returns.
It's a big step for you to be a man about it and tell the truth. And for that, I'm grateful and I appreciate it. But I don't want any shock to my system when I go talk to your brother, because you realize to verify what you're saying, I'm going to attempt to talk to Jason and to Zach, who are the other two people you say were in the room. And I don't want to hear anything, I don't want any difference at all. If they agree to cooperate 100% like you're doing, I don't want there to be any difference in anything that's said.
Even when the words are hard to hear, the pattern is unmistakable. Approval when Dylan moves toward the story investigators expect, and pressure whenever uncertainty appears. Now, at this point in the interrogation, some really strange shit starts to happen. investigators introduce a completely new idea into the story. Up to this moment, Dylan has never claimed that Holly was targeted because of him. He never said that she was the prettiest girl he'd ever seen. He never said that the others went to get Holly for him. But suddenly, investigators begin suggesting exactly that. One of them asked Dylan whether Holly was, quote, the prettiest girl he'd ever seen. Dylan immediately says no. Then the investigator pushes further and suggests that maybe Zach or Jason went to get Holly for Dylan. Again, Dylan says no, but the suggestion does not stop there. Instead, the investigators begin building this narrative out loud. They start describing a scenario where the group is sitting around getting high and talking about finding a girl. They speculate that maybe Dylan said something about wanting to sleep with the prettiest girl in the county. Maybe that comment triggered Zach and Jason to go get Holly. Because that is how sexual predators usually work. Give me a freaking break. Maybe bringing her back was some kind of a gift to Dylan. Yes, they say that. And then the investigator asked Dylan directly, quote, maybe that's what triggered him going to get her, like a gift to you. Does that make sense?
Well, answer me this. Maybe you didn't plan for it to happen this way. But the topic of conversation, undisputed by you sitting here, is that while you're sitting around getting high before they went and got her, the subject is, we can find some girl and get her up here and get some. Right? You're going to go find some girl and hit it. Is that what was being said?
That's what they said.
What they said. You're part of the conversation. You're sitting there, Dylan. You're smoking dope with them. You're sitting around in the same house with your brother and his best friend. And they're talking about getting some girl. It don't matter who at that point. They're talking about getting some. Get high. Let's go get some girl over here and get some tail from it. That's what's being talked about. Did you bring her name up and say, you know what? If I was going to get to hit something, I'd like to get the prettiest girl in the county. You know what I'm saying? Because maybe if you said something like that, maybe that's what triggered them going and getting her. It's some kind of just, for whatever reason, a gift to you. Does that make sense? Does it make sense? Is that what happened? Did you ask them to go get her?
That's a remarkable moment because the investigator has just laid out an entire theory of the crime step by step and then asked Dylan whether it makes sense. And Dylan responds with 2 words, yes, sir. But even in that moment, Dylan still denies asking them to get her. So the narrative now being constructed in the room looks like this. The group is using meth. They decide to find a girl. Dylan supposedly mentions the prettiest girl he's ever seen. Zach and Jason then go abduct Holly as some kind of a twisted gift to Dylan. There's a lot of major problems with that theory, but 2 of the big ones are, first, Dylan never actually said those things until the investigators suggested them. And second, the premise itself raises serious questions because investigators repeatedly suggest that this kind of behavior, finding women, bringing them back to the house, having sex with them while they're high, was something that the group had done before. But like I said before, think about the geography that we're talking about here. Holiday, less than 100 residents. Parson, just over 2,000. Within 5 miles, maybe 1,600 people altogether. That kind of pattern would not remain hidden in a rural community this small. Yet the interrogation repeatedly treats it as though it's normal. And then investigators say something that might be the most revealing line in this entire section. After hearing Dylan's account, one investigator says, quote, Do you understand how the way you describe the story at this point makes absolutely no sense? Yeah, that statement is 100% correct. This story makes no sense. But instead of stopping the interview and questioning whether the confession itself is reliable at all, the investigators move forward because now the goal becomes something completely different. Not determining whether the story is true or not, but getting Dylan to make the story make sense. At this point, the interrogation no longer sounds like investigators learning what happened, if it ever did. It sounds like investigators trying to help the story make sense. So at the next point in the interrogation, the conversation takes a turn that is difficult to listen to because the investigator begins describing Holly in a way that doesn't sound like a question at all. It sounds like a story. TBI officer says that he can, quote, almost see the conversation happening. He imagines the group sitting around smoking meth. He imagines someone making a comment about Holly being beautiful. Then he says something that stands out immediately. He tells Dylan that Holly was the prettiest girl in Decatur County, and then he asks Dylan if he agrees. Now that statement doesn't come from Dylan. Dylan never said Holly was the prettiest girl in the county. In fact, earlier in the interrogation, he specifically denied ever saying that. But now the investigator repeats the idea and reinforces it himself. He even adds his own commentary saying that he has spent a lot of time in Decatur County and he's never seen a prettier girl than Holly.
Because I can almost see it, I can almost see that conversation happening. And then, because you have seen her and you know how beautiful she was, you made the comment, prettiest girl in Decatur County. You're right. I've been in Decatur County a lot, and I ain't seen another one as pretty as her ever since I've been over there. You agree with that? Is that what happened?
Weird as shit. And then he turns back to Dylan and asks again if that's what happened. This is no longer a question seeking information. It's an investigator describing a scenario where I don't even know what the hell this is. An investigator describing a scenario and asking the suspect to confirm it and saying that the investigator is the one that is saying that he spent a lot of time around here, man. He's never seen anybody hotter than Holly. Like, inappropriate? Weird? Creepy? I don't even know what words to use to describe this shit. But the distinction is important because when investigators begin supplying the narrative themselves, then the interrogation shifts from information gathering to story building. And I gotta say, as I'm listening to this quote unquote confession multiple times, I'm like, why is Dylan even in the room? Why did Dylan could be 20 miles away and they'd be accomplishing the same thing. The investigators sitting there telling a story to each other. It's weird as shit. That shift becomes even clearer when the officer continues outlining how he imagines the crime unfolded. He suggests that the group was sitting around getting high, that they were talking about finding a girl. Someone mentions Holly. And then according to the investigator's own version of events, someone says, let's go get her. Again, that sequence of events does not come from Dylan. It comes from the investigator. And then after laying out the entire narrative, the officer asks Dylan, is that what happened? At that moment, the interrogation is essentially turned into a guided reconstruction, where the investigator describes what he thinks the story should be, and the suspect is asked to agree to that. Now, there's another tactic that shows up immediately after this. Investigators begin reinforcing other people, friends Dylan supposedly talked to, people who allegedly heard him tell parts of the story. One investigator mentions speaking to someone named John Tubbs and warns Dylan not to deny anything because they've already talked to him. This is another well-known interrogation strategy. Investigators imply that other witnesses have already confirmed the story. They already know everything. Even when the suspect doesn't know exactly what those witnesses said, the purpose is simple. It creates this impression that denial is pointless because everyone already knows the truth. After this, the investigators introduce yet another element. They suggest other people may also have assaulted Holly. They mention Shane Austin by name. Again, that detail does not originate with Dylan. It appears as another investigator suggests it. And then the questioning pivots back to sensory details. What did Dylan hear? What did Holly say? What sounds came from the bedroom? The goal here is clear. Investigators are trying to move Dylan into describing events that he claims he didn't see, only things that he supposedly heard, which lowers the burden of accuracy because when someone describes sounds instead of actions, the details become far harder to verify.
You say that after you raped her, Zach raped her. And then you say that you were told to stay in the living room area and that Zach and Shane carried her into Zach's bedroom. I'm sorry, you're right. Jason Autry, I misspoke. Jason Autry and Zach carried Holly into Zach's bedroom. What did you hear, see? Was she crying for help? What was she saying? What were they doing to her?
At this point, the interrogation no longer sounds like investigators asking what happened. It sounds like investigators describing what happened and then asking Dylan to agree to it. There's another detail in this interrogation that sounds minor until you realize what it signals. Early on, Dylan says they were shooting meth, not smoking it. Shooting. We talked about it. It's injecting. Everybody had their own rig. Then that's Dylan's word choice. But if you listen throughout the entire rest of the interview, the investigators keep repeating the phrase smoking dope over and over and over. Smoking dope, smoking dope. You were smoking dope. Even while Dylan is describing a completely different method of use. Now, that might sound like semantics, but it's not, because in a true confession, you expect the suspect's language and the sensory details that they're describing to be driving the narrative. Instead, what happens here is the absolute opposite. The investigator's phrasing becomes the dominant language of the story, and Dylan is then pulled along behind it. And then we get to the next problem. Dylan has already said earlier in the interview that he didn't remember anyone else coming by that night. No visitors, no one stopping in, no one buying drugs. They asked him specifically. No one hanging out. That's what he says. But then investigators introduce a new name. They bring up Shane Austin. They ask about Shane repeatedly, and then suddenly, just like magic, Dylan says Shane was there. The investigator asks, who else came by? Even if it was just stopping by to get some dope. And Dylan answers, Shane came over.
Was Shane over there smoking dope with y'all during the night before this? Or was he over there hanging out during any of this dope smoking? Who else?
He said days before.
I'm not talking about days before, Dylan. I'm talking about when we started this conversation tonight. We were talking about around 7 p.m. Between 7 and midnight, who else came by and was a part of anything, even if it was just stopping by to get some dope, or stopping by to say hi, or hanging out, or what?
Shane came over there at that time.
Shane Austin came over to the house. How'd he get there?
I don't know.
In what?
They dropped him out.
Now that's the first time that Shane shows up in Dylan's timeline for that entire night. And it happens right after investigators have already planted Shane into the conversation and then started pressing. Then the investigator immediately reacts with disbelief and pressure. He essentially says, okay, now you've said something that you can't explain. He presses Dylan on how Shane got there, when he got there, and most importantly, why Dylan is just now telling them this. And then comes the line that tells you everything about the technique being used. The investigator says, quote, "Take a minute. You better get everything to come back to you. You understand?"
You take a minute, Dylan. And you better get everything to come back to you. Understand?
That's not evidence gathering. That's coaching. It's the idea that if Dylan just sits there long enough, under pressure, after being told that he's lying, after being told that his story makes no sense, the right memories will just suddenly materialize. And once that happens, the conversation immediately pivots to the next goal. What does Shane know? Did Shane participate? Did Shane rape her? So watch what happens structurally. Dylan says he doesn't remember anyone else being there. Investigators introduce Shane. Dylan then suddenly places Shane there, and then investigators treat that as progress, and they press forward into Shane's alleged participation. This is exactly what contamination looks like in real time. Not necessarily one dramatic aha moment, but the slow process of investigators supplying the framework, then the suspect filling in the blanks under pressure. Shane doesn't enter Dylan's story because Dylan volunteers him. Shane enters the story because investigators insert him, and then Dylan is forced to agree. Now, this next portion of the interrogation raises another major problem. Investigators suddenly begin asking Dylan about a video. One of them says Dylan has probably heard people talking about arrests and a video. Then the questioning becomes very direct. They ask who made the video. They ask whether Dylan is in the video. They ask whether Zach made the video. But you'll notice something very important. Dylan never says the video exists. Not once. Instead, he repeatedly says the same thing in different ways. He says, "I don't know. I have no clue." He says he didn't make a video. He says he doesn't know if anyone else did. But the investigators continue pressing the idea. They suggest that if Dylan was assaulting Holly and Jason was holding her down, then Zach must have been doing something else, and maybe that something else was recording it. And at this point, the questioning becomes highly suggestive. An investigator asks Dylan if Zach had his phone out. Dylan says, "Yes, sir." And immediately the investigator builds a conclusion from that. If Zach had his phone out, maybe he was recording. Maybe there's a video. Maybe Zach threatened Dylan with the video. Maybe the video exists as proof. But again, all of that is speculation, and it's coming from the investigators, not from Dylan.
I want to know about the video. I want to know about the video.
I just told you what that out this video.
Who made the video? Is the video of you? Is it of Zach? Is it of who?
That's not me.
It's not you. What? Well, if you didn't make the video, you stood there and watched Autry rape her, and he held her down himself. So if Autry was holding her down while you were raping her, is that right?
Yes.
Or did you hold her down yourself?
Yes.
You had help holding her down? What was Zach doing?
He just came back over.
Did he have his phone out, Dylan? Did he make a video of this?
He may have. I don't know.
He had his phone out.
Yes, he did.
And then the conversation turns to something else that's important for context. The investigators begin asking about the type of phone that Zach supposedly had. They ask if it was an iPhone. Now, remember the time frame that we're talking about here. This interrogation is happening in 2014, about a crime from 2011. Phones at that time were capable of video, sure, but nothing like the high-resolution, high-storage smartphones that people carry today. Many people, especially in rural areas, were still using flip phones or low storage devices, but Even investigators during this interview acknowledged that the phone Dylan is talking about might have been a, quote, old flip phone.
You know that's an old crap phone, right? That's an old flip phone. What's this kind of phone called? iPhone. You know what that is? Zach have an iPhone?
What time is it?
Did he have an iPhone that day? You said you saw him with a phone out. Is it the iPhone he had out?
I think so.
You believe so or you know so?
I think so.
But instead of letting that uncertainty stand, the investigators keep steering the conversation back to the same idea. Maybe it was an iPhone. Maybe it was recorded video. Maybe Zach filmed the assault. Eventually, Dylan says something that reveals just how uncertain he actually is. He says, "I believe it did." And then the investigators ask why he believes that, and Dylan gives a very simple explanation. Well, because Zach had his phone out. That's it. Not because he ever saw a video, not because he watched a recording, not because Zach ever showed it to him, just because Zach had his phone out.
Why do you believe it did?
Well, he had his phone out. I don't know what else he'd be doing with his phone.
So if there's a video of it, it had to be Zach doing the video. And he either is videoing you or Jason. When he threatened you not to ever tell about it, did he tell you, I videoed you, and if you ever tell anybody, I'll show them the video of you raping the truth, and you'll never be able to tell this? He just threatened you with a gun and said, I'll kill you if you tell it. Didn't tell you, I've got proof. Did.
From that moment, the investigators begin talking as if the existence of a video is essentially established, but what Dylan has actually said is something very different. He doesn't know if a video exists. He's never seen one. And he can't confirm that one was ever recorded. He just thinks it might have been. The idea of a video did not come from Dylan. It came from the investigators. By the end of the exchange, Dylan was left agreeing that one might exist simply because Zach had a phone in his hand. Now, as the interrogation continues, there's a moment where the investigator says something that reveals a lot about just how this interview is being conducted. He tells Dylan, quote, "Something you told me in here is not true, and we're going to fix it right now."
So something you told me in here is not true. And we're going to fix it right now.
That's a very specific choice of words. Notice what he does not say. He does not say, we need to figure out what really happened here. He does not say, I need you to help me clear some things up that I have some questions about. He doesn't say, Dylan, I need you to be honest with me. Instead, the framing is completely different. The investigator has already decided that something Dylan said is wrong, and the goal now is to fix the story. In other words, the problem isn't that investigators might have misunderstood something. The problem, from the investigator's perspective, is that Dylan's version doesn't match what the investigator believes is true, wants to be true, has already decided is true. So the story needs to be corrected. It needs to be fixed. And the reason the investigator gives for this correction is interesting as well. He points out that Dylan didn't mention Shane Austin earlier in the conversation. Dylan only mentioned Shane after investigators began asking about him directly. And that's true. But instead of questioning whether the introduction of Shane into the story might have been suggested by the investigators themselves, the investigator treats it as proof that Dylan is leaving things out. He tells Dylan that he can't have it both ways. He tells him that he already knows a lot. He reminds him that Dylan isn't the only person that they've talked to. And then he lays down a rule. Dylan must not leave anyone's name out. He also must not include anyone who wasn't involved, which places Dylan in a difficult position.
I don't care who else's name comes up in it. If they're involved, they're involved. Don't you dare put someone's name in this that ain't involved. But don't you dare leave somebody's name out. Do we agree on that?
Because at this point in the interview, multiple names have already been introduced by the investigators themselves. And Dylan is being told two things at the same time. Don't leave anyone out, but don't say something that's wrong. So the safest path forward becomes agreeing with the direction the investigators are already moving. And the investigator reinforces that dynamic with another phrase. He says, quote, "That's the only way I can get to the truth." But notice again what the truth seems to mean in this context. It doesn't mean exploring multiple possibilities. It means bringing Dylan's account into alignment with the version of events that investigators have already chosen to believe. And right after that moment, the interview pauses for a break. The investigators leave the room, and one of them says something else that reveals what they're focused on next. He says he wants to find an actual diagram of the house because getting the layout right is important. Even though up to this point, investigators are still trying to determine whether the events that Dylan is describing actually happened there at all.
And I'm going to try to get an actual diagram of the house while you're taking a break, because that's all important to me, to make sure I've got some kind of diagram that we know is accurate of the drawing of the house, okay? Let me show you where the bathroom's at right quick. We're going to take a break.
Now, after this break in the interrogation, the tone of the interview changes noticeably. When Dylan returns to the room, the investigators explain that they stepped outside for a few minutes. They say they went out for a smoke. During the break, Dylan apologized to him for, quote, being this way. Then the questioning resumes, but the tone is different. Earlier in the interview, the questioning often alternated between reassurance, suggestion. We talked about that. Now the tone becomes way more direct and more forceful. One investigator tells Dylan that they are well past the point of deception. He tells Dylan not to mislead them, not to lie about anything. And the questioning moves immediately back to Shane Austin.
I appreciate what you're doing now, but man, we're so far beyond the point of any deception, lie, whatever you want to call it, misleading me. Don't mislead me on nothing. Don't lie to me about nothing. Explain right back to where we were at. You said that Shane was there and that somebody dropped him off. Who dropped him off?
Remember, Shane only entered Dylan's story after investigators began asking about him earlier in the interview. Now, after the break, Shane becomes a central focus of the questioning. Investigators ask who dropped him off. They ask when he arrived. They asked whether he participated in the drug use that night. And they continue pushing the idea that Shane must have been involved in the conversations about finding a girl. Investigators even begin describing what they think the conversation looked like. They say that the group was sitting around using drugs, talking about going and getting a girl, talking about bringing her back. And then the investigator asked Dylan whether Shane was part of that conversation. At one point, the investigator even stops himself and acknowledges something very important. He says, "I've put words in your mouth there." Yeah, you think?
There's got to be some reason. I know you do. There's some reason that you have now mentioned Shane. There has to be a reason that you went ahead and mentioned that. What's important about Shane Austin being there? What did he say? What did he do? Did he go with him? How did he get away from the house, Dylan? You say his parents, and if it wasn't his parents, somebody dropped him off. But you undisputed say he was there while y'all were smoking dope, while a conversation about taking Holly Bobo. I've put words in your mouth there. You didn't say that. I said that.
But the questioning continues in the exact same direction, and then another detail appears in the conversation. The investigator says that Shane Austin offered his house as a place to keep the girl. Now, that's a new claim, and it does not, again, originate from Dylan. It comes from the investigator during the questioning. Dylan's response is that he doesn't know what happened after Zach and Jason left, which highlights something that has been consistent throughout much of this interview. Many of the narrative details being discussed in the room are being introduced by the investigators themselves. And Dylan's role often becomes just responding to those suggestions rather than initiating any of them.
And you're saying that Shane Austin was there while let's go get a girl and rape a girl conversations happening.
Did they say that we're gonna go to Holly Bobo? Or go get Holly? Or go get her?
Go get her.
Shane Austin offered his place up as a place to keep a girl while they raped her.
I don't know when they left at 12, or 1, when they left that night. They, Shane, Zach, and Austin, stay there. From that point, I don't know what took place and what.
By this point, the story is not unfolding naturally. It is obviously being constructed piece by piece during the questioning itself. Now, Shane Austin has already appeared in the conversation, but like I said, only after investigators put him there. Now the questioning escalates. The investigators tell Dylan something very specific. Quote, "What you don't know is what Shane has told me." End quote. Now, that's a classic interrogation tactic. It suggests that investigators already know the truth and that another person has already confirmed it. Nothing wrong with that, but Dylan doesn't know what Shane has supposedly said, so the safest path forward becomes agreeing with the direction that the investigators are moving. The investigator even labels the moment explicitly. He calls it a, quote, honesty checkpoint. And then it repeats the same warning several times. Don't lie to me. Do not lie to me right now. Don't lie to me.
So this is an honesty checkpoint in our conversation, Dylan. You can't lie to me about it. You understand that? Don't lie to me. Do not lie to me right now.
From there, the questioning begins steering the narrative again. Investigators start asking whether the conversation that night changed from talking about a girl to talking about Holly specifically. They ask who brought her name up, and they repeatedly suggest that Shane may have been the one who introduced Holly into the conversation. Even Dylan then agrees that Shane helped plan it.
Who brought Holly up? And if you did, I'm not messed up about it, Dylan, just tell the truth. Who brought Holly's name up? Okay. Did Shane admit that he'd been at the coon hunt, following around, taking pictures of her?
But what's important is how the conclusion is reached, because before this moment, the interview had already established something very different. Earlier in the interrogation, Dylan said Shane wasn't even there that night. And then Shane only entered the timeline after investigators began asking about him directly. And now suddenly, Shane isn't just present, he's part of the planning. And then the investigators go even further. They begin constructing a specific version of the planning conversation. They suggest that Shane might have said something like, "I know a girl. I know Holly Bobo. I know where she lives."
I know a girl, Shane said, that's where you're at. I know a girl, I know Holly Bobo. Who said something about knowing where she lives? What did he say about it?
I know where she lives at.
What else did he say?
What else did he say?
He told him, let's go get her later on.
He said, let's go get her. You're saying he went with them.
What else did he say?
That's all I heard.
What did
What did he say
Zach
about-
say?
He didn't really just answer right away.
He said he knew her, didn't he?
Like he did.
Those phrases are introduced by the investigators themselves, and then Dylan is asked to confirm them. At one point, the exchange becomes especially revealing. The investigator asks what Zach said in response. Dylan answers, quote, "He didn't really just answer right away." And then the investigator immediately follows with a suggestion, which is, quote, "He said he knew her, didn't he?" Dylan responds, "I think he did." That exchange illustrates the pattern that has appeared throughout this entire interview. Uncertainty, suggestion, agreement. And by the end of the sequence, the story is expanded yet again. Now Shane Austin is part of the planning conversation. He may have been the whole reason that they went after Holly, And investigators are already moving the narrative forward towards the next step, where the group allegedly went after the abduction, and specifically towards Shane Austin's house.
He said they had to go get her.
Shane Austin offered his place up as a place to keep the girl while they raised her.
I don't know, that's when they left at 12, or 1, when they left that night.
What's striking about this entire progression is that many of these narrative elements originate not from Dylan, but from the investigators. Dylan just responds with uncertainty. But the questioning continues. Those suggestions gradually just become part of the story.
But they went to his house first.
You believe it or you know it?
I know they did.
How do you know they went there?
But they didn't come straight back to the house after that.
Don't hold anything back.
By the end of the exchange, Shane has gone from not being present to helping plan the abduction to possibly suggesting Holly is the target to using his house to keep her, all within the span of a few minutes of questioning. But now the investigators are facing a problem. The timeline doesn't make sense. There's a gap between Holly Bobo's abduction and the moment that the men supposedly returned to Zach Adams' house. And the investigator acknowledges it directly. He says, quote, "There's a big gap in time."
Where'd they go? Where was Shane Austin when they got back to your house?
I think my word again.
How did he get to his house if he went with them to take her? How do you get back to his house and then them to there, but there's a big gap in time?
But instead of asking Dylan to explain the gap, something else happens. A new location suddenly appears in the story. Shane Austin's trailer. Up till this moment, Shane Austin had already entered the narrative in a very unusual way. First, Dylan said nothing, then the investigators bring him up, and then Dylan said Shane had been there. Then the investigators suggest that he helped plan it, and now the story is going to expand again because the investigators introduce the next step. They ask, where did they go? Where was Shane Austin when they got back to your house? And then the suggestion comes almost immediately.
But they went to his house first.
You believe it or you know it?
I know they did.
They went to his house first? The investigator doesn't ask if they went to Shane's house. He proposes the idea and asks Dylan whether he believes it or not. Dylan responds, "I know they did." But the explanation that follows never actually establishes how Dylan would know that, because by his own account, he stayed behind. He wasn't in the vehicle. He wasn't present for whatever happened between Holly's house and Zach's house. Yet, suddenly he knows they stopped somewhere first. And from that point forward, the interrogation begins steering Dylan toward filling in the details of what allegedly happened at Shane Austin's trailer. The investigator begins pressing for specifics. What did Shane say about Holly? What convinced the others to go get her? How long had they been planning this? Was someone stalking her? Had someone been watching the house?
There's been some research into this idea, or he's been stalking her, or you've been stalking her, or Zach or Jason's been, one of y'all knew enough about her to go get her.
None of these ideas come from Dylan. They all come from the TBI investigators. And then comes one of the most revealing statements of the entire interrogation. And that's when the investigator tells Dylan, quote, "Every minute that I talk to you about this, when I back you up in a corner, you keep spitting out more details." That statement is supposed to frame the process as uncovering the truth, but what listeners are actually hearing is something totally different. A narrative that keeps expanding as new suggestions are introduced, because only moments later, the investigator escalates the claim again. He tells Dylan, quote, "You know that Shane has to know that you raped her too. He has to know that everybody raped her." And then he goes even further, quote, "He obviously got to rape her somewhere between point A and point B."
You had to have a pact with each other about keeping your mouth shut. You know that Shane has to know that you raped her too. He has to know that everybody raped her. he obviously got the raper at somewhere between point A, her house, and B, your house.
That's not a question. That's an assertion. At this point in the interrogation, the investigators are telling Dylan that Shane Austin must have raped Holly as well, and they're telling him that the only thing left to determine is where it happened. Somewhere between Holly's house and Zach Adams' house, which is exactly where Shane Austin's trailer now appears in the story. Investigators are trying to fill a gap in their narrative, and I say that specifically, their narrative. But the cell phone data that I covered in the last Distilled episode already shows where Holly's phone actually traveled during that window, which means there's two competing timelines. The physical cell tower record and this evolving weird-ass interrogation narrative, and the two don't match. So in the span of a few minutes, Shane Austin has gone from not even being part of the story to helping plan the abduction to having a trailer that suddenly sits right in the middle of the timeline, and finally to investigators declaring that he must have raped Holly somewhere along the route. So by this point, the investigators have already began shaping their own freaking narrative. New people have entered the story, new locations have appeared, and now something else happens. The investigators begin correcting Dylan's language. So during this part of the interview, Dylan repeatedly uses uncertain phrasing. He says things like, I believe, I think, I don't know. These are normal expressions of uncertainty, but the investigators do not allow them. At one point, Dylan says that he believes Shane may have been following Holly, and the response is immediate. The investigator cuts him off and says, quote, don't ever say that the rest of the night in here. Don't say I believe.
Maybe he did. Oh,
Well, did he or did he not?
believe it did. Don't ever say that the rest of tonight here with me. Don't say I believe blank. Don't just drop that in your vocabulary.
Now that instruction is important because uncertainty is being removed from the conversation. From this point forward, Dylan is expected to speak in definitive statements, even about things that he's already said he's not sure about. And then another pattern appears. The investigators begin telling Dylan to say Holly's name. Not her, not the girl, Holly. The investigator even instructs him directly, quote, say her name. Get used to saying her name.
I don't know how much Shane knew about all that time. I know.
Say her name. Get used to saying her name.
I don't know how much he knew about her.
Well, that may seem really small, but psychologically, it is significant. Repeating a victim's name anchors the story emotionally. It also reinforces the narrative that the investigators are building. Instead of describing a vague scenario involving a girl, the conversation now revolves around a specific person, Holly Bobo. And once that shift happens, the questioning becomes more assertive. The investigators start building out what the planning conversation supposedly sounded like, and they suggest that someone had been stalking her, that someone had been following her, that someone knew where she lived. Those ideas appear in the questioning before Dylan ever confirms them. And each time Dylan hesitates or expresses uncertainty, the investigators steer him back towards certainty. Don't say I think. Don't say I believe. Say what happened. Say her name. The result is a conversation where uncertainty is gradually removed and replaced with statements that sound increasingly confident. But confidence isn't coming from Dylan. Much of it's being shaped by the questioning itself. In a legitimate investigative interview, uncertainty is valuable. Investigators want to know what a witness actually knows versus what they're unsure about. But here the questioning is moving in the opposite direction. Expressions of uncertainty are corrected and the narrative is pushed towards certainty, even when the person speaking has already said that they aren't sure. By now, the interrogation has moved far beyond simply asking Dylan what happened. The investigators are correcting his language, shaping the narrative, and steering him towards specific conclusions. Conclusions that will soon place Shane Austin directly in the path between Holly's house and Zach Adams' property. During this next segment of the interrogation, the investigators return to the beginning of the supposed planning conversation. They want Dylan to describe how the idea to abduct Holly first came up, but the exchange quickly reveals a pattern that has appeared several times already. The investigators begin reconstructing the story themselves, and Dylan is asked to confirm the pieces of it.
So this plan is that simple. It's just literally that simple. Bunch of bored guys sitting around smoking dope, start getting horny, get ready to go. Let's rape a girl. Hey, I know a really good-looking girl, Holly Bobo. I've been going to school with her. I saw her, whatever, But that's how simple this plan really is.
So the questioning starts with Shane Austin. Investigators suggest that Shane said something like, "I know a girl, Holly Bobo," and then they ask Dylan what Shane said about her. Dylan struggles to answer. At one point, he explains that he didn't actually hear much of the conversation. He says he had already been told that Shane knew Holly from school, but the investigators immediately bring the focus back to what they want to establish. They say, quote, "All that matters is what you saw and what you heard." And then they begin narrating the scenario themselves. One investigator summarizes the entire alleged plot out loud. He says, "It's basically just a group of men sitting around smoking drugs, getting horny, and deciding to go rape a girl." He even fills in the details. Someone says that they know a good-looking girl, Holly Bobo. Someone says they know where she lives, and then the decision is made, let's go get her. None of those statements are coming from Dylan. They are coming from the investigators. And after laying out that entire scenario, the investigators asked Dylan if that's what happened. Later in the same exchange, the narrative becomes even more explicit. The investigator summarizes the story again. He says Shane suggested Holly. He says Dylan agreed that she was attractive. And he says that the two, quote, ringleaders, Zach Adams and Jason Autry, decided to go get her. And then he asked Dylan if that version is correct.
Don't lie about this. Did you agree that she was hot, good-looking girl and all that? You did say that? So once they had your 2 cents worth about, yeah, she's hot, she's good-looking, Shane's going on about how good-looking she is and knowing where she lives and all that, then you go from there to all of a sudden the 2 ringleaders of everything y'all do say, "If it, we'll go get it." Is that right?
Now, at this point, the conversation has shifted from discovering a story to confirming one that's already been described. Instead of Dylan explaining the events in his own words, or any words at all for that matter, investigators are laying out a sequence and then telling him to agree with it. That's important because it changes the whole dynamic of the interrogation. The story's no longer emerging organically as if it ever was, but it's being constructed piece by piece through suggestion and confirmation. In investigative interviewing, one of the most important principles is to allow the witness or the suspect to tell the story in their own words, whether it's true or untrue. Leading the narrative can introduce suggestion, memory contamination, or simple agreement under pressure, but in this section, the investigators repeatedly summarize what they believe happened, and then they tell Dylan to confirm it. That approach transforms the interrogation from any kind of a process of discovery and into a process of confirmation. So in the next segment of the interrogation, the investigators move forward as if the basic timeline has already been established. They begin asking Dylan about what happened after Holly was brought back to the house. But before we go any further into what they claim happened inside that house, we have to pause and look at something very critical, because by this stage of the investigation, there was already objective data showing where Holly's phone actually was that morning. We've talked about it. The data creates a massive problem for the story that's being told here. From the cell tower records, we discussed before that we know several things with a high degree of certainty. 7:30 to 8:11 in the morning, Holly's phone is at home. Everything's normal. 8:17, 8:26, it begins moving north, connects to Shiloh Road. That's several miles away from her home. And importantly, it doesn't place her at Zach Adams' house. And it also doesn't place her at Shane Austin's trailer. And between 8:26 and 9:06, the phone goes silent, but investigators ping the device twice, and those pings show the phone sitting stationary in the northeast sector of that same tower for roughly 30 minutes. And the location is important because that is the area where Holly's remains would eventually be discovered. So physical evidence shows this sequence. Holly's phone moves north towards the interstate. Then it stays stationary in that northern sector for roughly a half an hour. That's where the phone is between 8:30 and 9. Now, compare that to the story that's being constructed in this interrogation. According to the narrative being built here, Holly was taken from her home around 8 in the morning. Then she was supposedly transported through a series of events that include stopping somewhere along the way, possibly going to Shane Austin's property, eventually arriving at Zach Adams' house, where she was allegedly assaulted again, we presume. But here's the problem. None of the suspects' phones placed them anywhere near where Holly's phone was located, and the places being discussed in the interrogation, Zach's house, Shane's trailer, none of them were in that direction either. So, to accept the confession narrative as being described, you would have to believe something very specific and very strange happened. Holly was taken around 8 a.m. and then transported somewhere else entirely, while her phone was somehow taken by somebody else towards where we know it was. And then her phone remained stationary there for roughly 30 minutes. I guess this person that took it just was sitting there reading a book. I don't know. And then somehow the men involved completed all the additional events, including dropping Shane Austin off, eventually returning to Zach Adams' house, multiple sexual assaults, all by around 9:30, 10 o'clock. So that timeline is extremely difficult to reconcile because the phone activity during the critical window places Holly's device in a completely different area. And in that area, the phone isn't moving. It's stationary for about a half an hour, exactly where her remains would later be discovered. Right after this, something else happens that's important. Investigators bring in a diagram of the house. They begin asking Dylan to physically mark where things supposedly happen, where the couch was, where Holly was assaulted, where blood was on the floor. They even have Dylan sign and date the drawing. The process can be powerful in an interrogation because it locks the suspect into a visual narrative. But again, there's a major problem. Multiple search warrants were executed on that property. And despite the description of a brutal assault involving multiple attackers and significant bleeding, investigators found no forensic evidence placing Holly Bobo inside that house. No blood, no DNA, no trace evidence connecting her to that location. So, while investigators are drawing diagrams of a crime scene inside the house, the only objective timeline that we have, Holly Bobo's cell phone, places her somewhere else entirely. So then, Dylan suddenly introduces a new detail. He says that Shane Austin once told him that Holly had been kept in a basement. Well, that immediately triggers a problem because Shane Austin lived in a trailer. Not a house, a trailer. And one of the investigators immediately points it out. He says, quote, "He lived in a trailer. There's no basement in that trailer."
How do you know? How do you know that they took her over to Shane's at some point during it? Are you trying to develop that out of me saying what I've said, or do you know it for fact? At what point did you ever have a discussion with Shane and figure it out? I need to know how you know they went there before coming over there is what you were involved in.
the great part that you're involved in. How do you know what they did before? Was there some texting going on?
I remember Shane telling me he had her in the basement one time.
He lived in a trailer. There's no basement in the trailer.
That statement is important because it's the kind of factual contradiction that normally stops a confession in its tracks. If someone claims a crime happened in a location that physically cannot exist, investigators usually have to pause and reevaluate the credibility of the story, but that's not what happens here. Instead, the investigators begin searching for another location that might have a basement. And they ask Dylan, which house had the basement? Shane's parents' house? Shane's grandmother's house? Some other house that Shane had access to? In other words, rather than stopping the story when the physical detail fails, the interrogation shifts toward finding a place where the story could possibly work. And the timeline problem grows even larger because now the story requires another stop. According to the narrative developing here, Holly would have had to have been taken from her home at 8 a.m, transported somewhere else, possibly to Shane Austin's location, possibly now to another property with a basement, and then eventually brought back to Zach Adams' house, where the assault that Dylan describes supposedly occurs at some point later. All of this happening within a window that the cell data already shows was occupied by something completely different, because during the same window of time, we know that the phone is moving in a totally different location. So the interrogation is now trying to reconcile three things simultaneously: a story about multiple locations, a timeline that's already extremely compressed, and physical evidence that places Holly's phone somewhere else entirely. Another revealing moment comes when Dylan tries to explain how he learned about the basement. He says Shane told him about it months later while they were driving down the road. So the detail isn't coming from something that Dylan witnessed. It's a claim about something someone supposedly told him after the crime.
Did you say which house has the basement?
He did say the basement.
Is Mom and Daddy's house? You ever been over there? Is there a basement?
Yes, sir.
There is a basement in it?
Yes, sir.
Are you sure of that?
I'm not going to be positive. I don't know.
Okay. Don't tell me nothing that you're not positive of, remember?
What house did he have access to that had a basement?
I don't know all that.
And even that explanation isn't consistent. When investigators ask if he's sure about the basement, Dylan immediately backtracks and says, "I don't know." That uncertainty is a huge red flag because the story now depends on a location that Dylan himself isn't even sure exists. And as if all of this isn't crazy enough already, the story then escalates again. Dylan claims Shane later told him that he had, quote, got some while Holly was in the basement. Investigators interpret that phrase as meaning that Shane had sex with her. And then comes one of the most dramatic leaps in the entire interrogation. The investigator asks, quote, "How many days did y'all keep her alive?"
He told you, he said what again?
He said he got some. He had some that when she was down there in his basement.
How many days did y'all keep her alive?
Well, that question introduces something entirely new. Up to this point in the story, the events have all been happening within hours. Now the investigators are talking about days, which would require Holly to have been held somewhere for an extended period of time. And again, there's absolutely no evidence that supports that scenario.
How long was she kept in the basement over there? Because nobody would hear her, nobody saying nothing about that house.
I don't know.
How long?
I don't know.
So at this point in the interrogation, the story requires a basement that may not exist, another house that hasn't been identified, and a timeline that now stretches from hours into days, all while Holly Bobo's phone was sitting somewhere else entirely. So at about 2 hours in, the tone shifts into a full-on reset. Dylan has just thrown out details that don't line up, basements that don't exist, extra locations that can't be placed, timeline gaps that don't work, And instead of stopping to verify, the investigators do something else. They accuse him of lying, but not in a way that shuts the interview down. They accuse him of lying in a way that re-anchors the narrative and pulls him back into compliance. Now, what they're doing here, this is the interrogation pattern. Accuse him of holding back and being deceptive. Quote, quit. You're trying to hold back information. 2, they immediately offer reassurance and absolution. Quote, I'm not mad at you. Nobody's judging you. 3, they reframe cooperation as moral cleansing and emotional relief. Have you been able to fall asleep since you told the truth? You'll never sleep with any peace until you tell all of it. And 4, they invoke the victim's family as a lever. Do you want Miss Karen to have answers? Then they promise psychological closure while minimizing the consequences by saying, whatever happens, happens. I'm here to help you get all that out. And then they demand the specific missing link that they need. What do you really know about her being anywhere other than Zach's house? Where she went first? What communication did you have with who? The last part matters. The whole speech is not really about truth. It's a pressure ramp. It's designed to funnel Dylan into supplying the next required piece of the prosecution's timeline, where Holly went first and who coordinated it.
You're never going to get full closure yourself of what you've done and what's been done until you tell all of it, Dylan. You're never going to sleep with any piece that you finally have done all you can do to fix this until you tell us everything. Do you understand that? Do you totally get that? You know I'm telling you the truth. So will you do that for me? Will you stop holding information back? I already told you you couldn't offend me, right? You believe that? You know I'm beyond all of the goriness of anything that happened. I'm beyond all that, okay? You want this over? You want Miss Karen to have answers? You want all of her family to get some closure to this? You want it over for you too? And just whatever happens, but okay. Then that's what I'm here to help you do. I'm here to help you get all that out of you. Okay?
Now, this is not how an investigator talks when they're purely trying to learn unknown facts. It's how you talk when they believe the person is malleable and they need the person to stop freelancing and they need the statement to fit an existing theory. And the language gives that away. Listen to what they don't do. They don't say, let's verify that. If you're not sure, don't guess. We're going to pause and check the records. Instead, they say, quit holding back. Stop worrying about what people think. Tell us everything. That's not verification. That's compliance conditioning. This is the part of the interrogation where the story starts failing. And instead of stopping, the interview switches into a reset. Dylan is told that he's holding back, then reassured that nobody's judging him, then pressured with guilt, sleep, and Karen Bobo's closure. Then they go straight back to the exact missing details that they need to make their timeline work. So the investigators begin focusing on something else entirely at this point. Evidence. Not where Holly was taken, not the timeline, but what Dylan supposedly did after the assault to cover it all up. The questioning shifts toward phones, clothing, DNA, and communication with Shane Austin. Investigators tell Dylan that they know he contacted Shane. They ask whether he called or texted. They ask which phone he used. They suggest that he texted Shane to tell him that the others were on their way. And again, the details are coming from the investigators themselves. They describe the sequence out loud, and then they ask Dylan to confirm it. They say, quote, you text Shane. They're on their way now. Then the questioning moves to physical evidence. The investigators begin asking about Dylan's clothes, specifically whether there was blood on them. And then the questioning becomes increasingly leading. They say, you raped her. You pulled your pants back up. There was blood on them. What did you do with the clothes? Did you wash them? Did you throw them away? Did you bag them up and put them in the trash? The pattern repeats again and again. The investigators describe what they believe happened, and then Dylan is asked to agree to it. They even introduce the whole concept of DNA into the conversation. They explain how biological evidence could link him to the crime, and then they ask whether that made him scared, whether the fear led him to get rid of his clothes. In other words, the investigators are not just asking what happened, they're constructing a whole forensic narrative, a story in which Dylan realizes he left evidence behind, and then he takes steps to destroy it, throwing his clothes away, changing phones, deleting messages. But there is a critical issue here. Despite multiple search warrants executed on the property, investigators never recovered the clothing that Dylan supposedly discarded. They never recovered blood evidence inside the house. They never recovered any biological evidence tying Holly Bobo to the location where Dylan claims these violent assaults occurred. So what the interrogation is producing here is not physical evidence. It's a story about evidence that no longer exists. A story in which the suspect explains how it was destroyed. And then they begin pushing Dylan about phone records. They suggest that he was communicating with Shane Austin during these events. They ask about specific phones, what phone he used, whether it had a camera, whether he deleted messages, whether he later changed phones entirely. They even ask where the physical phone is now, because if the phone could be recovered, it might confirm the communication. But Dylan's answers are vague. He says he thinks that his grandpa has the phone. Maybe at his house, but maybe at his work. He can't be for sure. Again, the evidence being discussed is something that cannot be verified in the moment. So by this stage, the narrative now includes multiple locations, multiple attackers, multiple rapes, discarded clothing, deleted phone messages, changed phones, destroyed evidence, but none of those elements are supported by physical evidence that was recovered during the investigation. Instead, they exist in the minds of the interrogators. It is only present in the confession narrative itself. So before we keep going, just a quick heads up. This next section isn't graphic, but it is psychologically ugly. So what you're about to hear is investigators trying to control how Dylan remembers events, down to how he's supposed to speak, while the timeline is already collapsing under the weight of the actual evidence. So they've already created a story that cannot survive contact with the real timeline. They're telling Dylan that Zach and Jason also goes by the name Train, left with Holly, and that Dylan is the one who's supposed to have looped Shane in. Then the investigator asks, what time of day is it now? And Dylan gives a time window between 1 and 2 in the afternoon. That alone is a flashing red light, because we already know that Zach, Dylan, and Shane have already been in Parsons by around 11. So now the confession doesn't just contradict the cell data, it contradicts basic physical reality. And instead of stopping and reassessing, they just keep building. They start asking about evidence management. Did you search the truck? Did you wash it? Did you scrub it? Did you look for blood? Did you destroy anything? They are narrating the cover-up behavior and trying to get Dylan to agree to it.
Now Shane's in the loop. He knows to be ready for them, so they don't have to be exposed to being on the road any longer than necessary. Did you hear what they say they were taking her? What time of day is it now? When they left it was around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Could it have been as late as almost 2 o'clock? I'm just asking. Somewhere between 1 and 2? No later than 2 o'clock though. Hey, what makes you know that by chance? Did you look around in your truck when you were carrying your bloody clothes that had evidence on them and got rid of them, did you look around in the truck thinking, God, I gotta get rid of anything else that's tied to her in my truck? You said you'd seen blood on her. Your mind you were in the mode of, I gotta get rid of this evidence that links me. You knew that she had been in your truck. What did you do to make sure there was no evidence in your truck? Did you clean it? Did you wash it? Did you go through it looking to make sure that her blood's not in there? I wouldn't look sure if there was anything in there. You didn't. Couldn't find nothing.
Then comes one of the most absurd interrogation moves in this entire tape. They argue out loud that Dylan's, quote, real truth came out when he was high. They tell him in plain language that when he gets high, he, quote, starts talking, that people have told them this, and that they already got the story from him because he talks when he's intoxicated. So now the pressure isn't just telling the truth, it's tell the truth the way you do when you're high. That's not how truth works, especially not with meth. Meth does not make people accurate. It makes them fast, paranoid, impulsive, suggestible, and sometimes outright delusional. People on meth will tell you that they saw God behind the gas station. They'll tell you that they solved the universal problems of mankind. They will tell you that they definitely didn't do something while describing it in detail. So when investigators say, tell us the truth in here, just like any time that you've been high, tell everything, what they're really doing is they're giving Dylan a model for what they want, a free association narrative, and then they're going to shape it, correct it, and punish him until it matches their version.
We got the story from you while you were high. You're not high today. How long you been sober? Forever, since you went to jail. Since you got out of jail, you've been watched like a hawk. Have you been intoxicated one time since you got out of jail? All right. So you've been out of jail over a month. There ain't no way you've been intoxicated. You're not intoxicated right now. Tell the truth in here, just like any time that you've been high out of your mind.
And then, right after they frame it that way, they hit him with the John Tubbs shot in the back of the head claim and demand that he explain it. Again, we get the same structure. They tell Dylan that someone else allegedly said what he said. They insist it's true because the other person has no reason to lie. They pressure Dylan to fill in the missing pieces. This is not Dylan walking them through what happened. This is investigators to try to force coherence into a story that keeps breaking, and doing it by leaning on, you talk when you're high, as if intoxication is a polygraph. Then they end with the line that tells you everything. Quote, you are the one who needs to be walking me through this. But he isn't. And he never has been.
I'm not in here to lead you on, okay, and walk you through this. You are the one who needs to be walking me through it.
So as the interrogation, if we can even still call it that, continues, something important begins to happen. The investigators just stop asking open questions. Instead, they begin introducing pieces of the story themselves openly and then ask Dylan to agree with them. One of the clearest examples of this comes when the conversation suddenly turns to an alleged beating. The investigators begin talking about Zach beating Dylan after the crime, but it's important how that's introduced. They don't ask a neutral question like, did Zach ever threaten you? Or did anything happen between you and Zach afterward? Instead, they begin with the assumption that it already happened. They tell Dylan that Zach beat him. They mention scars. They mention Dylan hiding at someone's house afterwards. And then they ask him to confirm it.
Had someone questioned you about it? Had you talked about it to somebody that got back to him? And what happened? Why did he punish you by beating you that bad and threatening to kill you? Why was he doing that?
That's not memory retrieval. That's what investigators sometimes call premise planting. The premise is introduced first, then the witness is asked to step into it. Even if the event actually occurred, presenting it in this way contaminates the answer because now the witness is responding to a narrative that investigators have already written. And this pattern repeats itself over and over and over again throughout this entire interrogation, especially this section of it. At one point, the investigators demand that Dylan identify who shot Holly, and Dylan's answers immediately start shifting. First one name, then another, then uncertainty. And instead of recognizing the confusion as a warning sign, the investigators treat it like a lie. They tell Dylan that a lie is unacceptable. They tell him he either knows or he doesn't. They force the question into a binary choice.
Answer the man's question.
What else he said?
When you knocked it further out and shot it.
Where?
It didn't think.
Who do you say actually shot him?
Okay.
So which one's the truth? Just a second ago you said him, now you say officer. What is the truth, Dylan?
Big officer.
You either know or you don't know, son. Don't tell a lie in here. A lie is unacceptable.
That's it.
Zach shot her? With what?
Okay.
What did he do with his gun?
But real memory does not work that way. When someone's under stress, when drugs are involved, when fear is involved, and when investigators are repeatedly interrupting and correcting them, there is a third possibility. They're guessing, not lying, guessing. They're trying to produce an answer that stops the pressure. And when the interrogations reach that point, the reliability of the statement totally collapses. And then another particularly revealing part is during questioning about what happened after the shooting, the conversation suddenly jumps to a completely new idea. The suggestion that Holly's body had been cut up. It appears abruptly. There's no clear lead-in. There's no explanation of where the idea originated. It simply enters the conversation and becomes another detail that investigators start pressing Dylan about. This is how interrogation narratives can grow in ways that have nothing to do with real evidence. One corrupted detail becomes the stepping stone for the next one. The story expands not because new facts are discovered, but because the conversation itself is generating them. And each new detail makes the narrative sound more dramatic, more specific, and more convincing, even when it may not be anchored in anything outside of that room. So then the investigators begin describing a conversation that supposedly happened the day after the crime. They tell Dylan that Shane admitted raping Holly. They tell Dylan that Shane said it was good, and then they ask Dylan about it. But at that point, Dylan hasn't described any of those conversations. The investigators have. They're declaring what supposedly was said and then telling Dylan to confirm it.
What discussion was there about what all had happened while y'all were hanging out? Anyone bragging about how good that was, or ha ha ha, we got her, and what kind of comments were made? Who's he? Did Shane say it was good? Okay. So Shane admitted to you the day after that he did have sex with her, that he raped her. And he said it was good.
Soon after that, the investigators introduce yet another narrative. They claim that Dylan told a man named John Tubbs what happened. They claim Tubbs repeated the story. They claim Zach found out, and they claim that this is why Zach beat Dylan. In other words, they present an entire cause and effect chain. Dylan talks to Tubbs, Tubbs talks to others, Zach finds out, Zach retaliates. But the entire sequence is spoken by the investigators themselves. Dylan isn't narrating it. He's just being asked to step into it. And that's an important distinction because when interrogators begin explaining the story for the suspect, the interrogation stops being a search for information. It stops being an interrogation, and it becomes a process of fitting the suspect into the investigator's story.
What had you done to piss him off so bad that he attacked you that way? Was it because you were talking about it and he found out, or what was it? I told you too long as you found out. Who did you tell? Hey, John. You told John Tubbs. And then John got to run in his mouth and Zach found out.
What did you tell John?
Exactly what all did you tell John about this?
And there's another important detail that it's easy to miss if you're only reading the transcripts, and that's silence. Long stretches of silence. You hear investigators waiting. You hear Dylan hesitating. You hear repeated instructions telling him not to think too hard about his answers. Don't think, just answer, spit it out. The silence isn't the quiet moment where someone recalls a memory. It's something else. It's the pause where a suspect is trying to figure out what in the hell he's supposed to be saying, what will stop the pressure, and when interrogations reach that stage, the answers that follow are not memories, they're just survival responses. But even if you ignored every one of those interrogation problems that we've been talking about, the leading questions, the planted premises, the shifting narrative, there's still a larger issue that this entire conversation cannot solve. That's the timeline, because outside the interrogation room, the phone data and the known movements of the people involved are still there. And those facts do not bend to match this story. So the interrogation continues building a narrative, but the evidence outside the room continues telling a totally different one. And as we move further, that gap between those two is only going to get wider. So for nearly 2 hours before this, the investigators have done almost all of the talking. They introduce the characters, they introduce the timeline, they introduce the locations, they introduce the crimes. But here, Dylan begins answering more questions directly, and the difference between memory and suggestion becomes really obvious. When investigators ask Dylan about something simple, something concrete, he actually responds like someone recalling an ordinary detail.
What all guns did Zach have during, I don't care about for the 10 years, what guns did Zach have when this happened? Oh, he had a 38 to 22.
They ask him what gun Zach had. Dylan says a 38 and a 22. He remembers the 22 being a pistol, and he even tries to describe the color, green, and he struggles to remember the brand name. That's what normal recall sounds like. Specific, limited, and imperfect. People remember fragments, colors, shapes, the general type of an object. They do not remember perfectly rehearsed narratives of complex crimes. And that contrast becomes important because as soon as Dylan gives them a few real-world details, investigators begin expanding the conversation into something much broader. Instead of staying with what Dylan personally saw or handled, they start asking about where different people stored guns. It's weird as shit.
You ever let Zach or Frank borrow a gun? I know of them, no. They do any swapping, trading for dope for a gun? No. What gun did you have at this time? Pistol-wise? Gun. What guns did Dick have at this time? Pistols. He had 357. What else? That's it.
Have any automatics?
No. Revolver. 257.
Where you keep that?
Right there in his nightstand.
Where they kept them, who owned which ones, whether they traded them, whether they swapped them for drugs. And slowly the conversation stops being about what Dylan remembers and starts becoming about what might be possible. Because Once you leave the territory of memory and move into speculation, then the narrative becomes extremely easy to steer. And that's exactly what happens next. The investigators then change direction yet again, and instead of focusing on objects or events, they start asking Dylan about people, specifically, who is talked to about this story. They ask him to start naming names, who he told, who else knows, who did you say anything to? And Dylan starts listing people.
Who all have you told anything about this to? Whether you told them the truth or a lie, I don't care. Who have you said anything to? Start naming them all. John who? John Tubbs. Wesley Bird. Jason. Who? Wesley Bird. Wesley Bird. Do you remember what all you told Wesley? You just know you told him something. Who else? Jason. Jason Gilbert. Did you ever tell Jason Gilbert that you raped her? Who have you admitted that to? You told other details of it, but you know the one that bugs you the most you didn't tell about.
John Tubbs, Wesley Bird, Jason Gilbert, others. And again, Dylan is extraordinarily difficult to understand, so if I get those names wrong, sorry, but it's shit like that. Now, this technique is important to understand because it creates the appearance of corroboration. If a suspect says something to 5 different people and investigators interview those 5 people, the story begins to feel like it has independent support, but that only works if the original story was reliable. If the story itself is unstable, if it's evolving during interrogation, then what you're really building is not corroboration. You're building a rumor network. And Dylan actually says something during the conversation that's incredibly revealing. When investigators press him about other relationships and things that he supposedly knows about the people involved, Dylan admits something plainly. He says that he is piecing things together from what different people have told him.
So you're piecing all this together in your head. Some parts you're learning from different people. Is that what you're telling me?
Think about that for a moment. The central witness in this confession is admitting that parts of what he believes happened are not things that he personally witnessed. They are things that he has assembled from conversations. In other words, parts of the story are secondhand information. And once secondhand information starts mixing with interrogation pressure, the line between memory and reconstruction becomes very thin. And then investigators take a bit of a darker turn. They begin pushing Dylan about statements that he supposedly made about Holly. They accuse him of telling people that Holly was sexually promiscuous. They insist that he said this. They say they know he said it, and they demand to know why. Now, that line of questioning does absolutely nothing to establish what actually happened. It doesn't prove where Holly went. It doesn't prove who she was with. It doesn't prove when she died. What it does do is introduce a narrative that devalues the victim. And unfortunately, that tactic appears in many interrogations involving sexual violence. Because once a victim is portrayed as promiscuous or reckless, it becomes psychologically easier for people to rationalize harm against them. But whether Holly dated someone, talked to someone, or even argued with someone has nothing to do with the basic question of this case. What actually happened to her on the morning that she disappeared? And this interrogation never answers that question. Instead, it keeps drifting into side stories and rumors and character judgments that don't establish any verifiable facts. One of the most revealing moments in this entire section happens when the investigators start asking Dylan about relationships between other people in the community. Did Zach know Natalie? Were they seeing each other? How did Dylan know this? And Dylan gives a very honest answer. He says he never actually saw them together. He just heard about it from someone else. Again, that's not a confession. That's someone explaining how rumors circulate inside a small group of friends or a small town. And when you step back, you start to see something important. This story is not being built from physical evidence. It's not being built from a consistent timeline. It's not even being built from a single firsthand witness. It's being assembled from pieces of conversation. Things different people supposedly said to each other after the fact. And at that point, the narrative stops being a witness statement and it becomes something closer to a group reconstruction. Everyone contributes a little piece, everyone fills in a blank, and eventually the story starts to feel complete, even if no single person actually saw the whole thing. So eventually investigators stop the questioning. They tell Dylan that they need a break. They're frustrated. They offer him a cigarette. They tell him that he's still free to walk around. They even mention that someone will stand nearby while he smokes. That moment might seem small, but it tells you a lot about the dynamics in that room. Interrogations move in cycles: pressure, relief, pressure again. The break functions as a reset. It lowers the tension in the room. It reestablishes rapport. And when questioning resumes afterwards, suspects are often more willing to continue talking. But by the time the break arrives, the larger problem with this interrogation is already clear. The story being constructed inside this room is not anchored in any physical reality at all and no physical timeline of the case. And when we return from the break, that problem is only going to become more obvious because the more details the interrogation produces, the harder it becomes to reconcile those details with what the actual evidence says. So after the break, the tone of the interrogation changes dramatically. Up to this point, the investigators have been doing a combination of things: pushing, suggesting details, correcting Dylan when his answers don't line up with what they expect, trying to steer the story towards a narrative that they can work with. But when the interrogation resumes, that strategy shifts. Now the message is simple. Dylan has disappointed him. The lead investigator tells him that he stepped out during the break. He spoke to other investigators who were supposedly listening in on the interrogation. And according to him, everyone agrees they have a problem with what Dylan has said. In fact, he says that they have a problem with everything Dylan has said. Then he escalates it further. He tells Dylan that when Dylan answers questions the way that he's been answering them, it means one of three things. Either he's lying, he's about to lie, or he's trying to invent something on the spot. And then the investigator makes something very clear. That part of the conversation is over. From this point forward, Dylan is not going to answer questions the way that he has been. And if he does, the interview ends.
I got problems with what you're saying. Period. You understand me? Problem. I asked you a question, you answer like this. You don't answer like that, then you're either lying, fixing to lie, or trying to dream some bullshit to blow up my ass. You understand that? That's over. Period. That is over. I'm fixing to ask you a few more questions about this. And if you start doing what you've been doing the whole night that we've been here, we are done. Okay?
That might sound like a routine interrogation tactic, but in the context of this case, it reveals something very important because by this point in the night, investigators have not received a clean narrative from Dylan at all. They have fragments, they have contradictions, they have pieces of a story that don't align with the timeline. And instead of stepping back and reassessing those problems, the interrogation strategy changes from gathering information to forcing alignment. The message becomes clear. The answers that Dylan has been giving up to this point are unacceptable, and those answers need to change. The investigator then moves to the next step. He asks Dylan a question. Where do you think that you're going tonight? He lets Dylan think about it. And then he answers it for him. Jail. Dylan is told that he is going to jail tonight. There's no ambiguity about it, no attempt to soften it. The investigator says plainly that no one in the room is going to sugarcoat anything anymore. Dylan is going to jail.
Dylan, I'm going to go ahead and tell you something else just to make sure you really understand this. What do you think fixing to happen to you tonight? Where do you think you're going? Take a guess. You think you're going back to Dennis's? No, sir. Where do you think you're going, Dylan? You know me. I don't sugarcoat nothing. I've told you I'll never lie to you, and I haven't. And I'm not going to start right now. Where do you think Dylan Adams is going after tonight? You're going to jail. You got that? Now, none of us are gonna sugarcoat anything in this room with you tonight, okay? You have to go back to jail.
This moment is important because it fundamentally changes the psychological environment of the interrogation. Before the break, the investigators are trying to keep Dylan talking. After the break, the interrogation introduces something new: certainty. Dylan is now being told that the outcome has already been decided. He's going to jail. The only thing left to determine is how this story ends. The shift matters for one very simple reason. Confessions are supposed to emerge voluntarily. They're supposed to come from a suspect explaining what happened. But once investigators begin telling a suspect that their answers are unacceptable, that everyone listening believes they're lying, and that they're going to jail regardless, the dynamic of the conversation changes. At that point, the suspect is no longer speaking freely. They are responding to pressure, and when interrogations reach that stage, then investigators often move to the next tactic. Instead of asking open-ended questions that require a narrative, they begin asking very simple questions. Questions that can only be answered one way or the other: yes or no. Because yes or no questions are much easier to control. They narrow the conversation. They limit the suspect's ability to explain. And they make it easier for investigators to guide the story toward the version that they already believe is true. This is also the point where any realistic idea that this is a spontaneous confession begins to totally fall apart, because a confession usually sounds like someone explaining something that they did. It's a narrative. It's messy. It's emotional. But what happens next in this interrogation is not narrative at all. What comes next is a series of yes or no questions, and that is not how a confession works. That's how an interrogation works when investigators already believe that they know the answer and they're just trying to make the suspect confirm it. Now, there's also been another significant change in the dynamic of the room when we come back from this break. The atmosphere has changed completely. The investigator is no longer speaking calmly. He's yelling. He's angry. He's pissed off. And the message that he delivers to Dylan is blunt. Dylan has failed them. He has disappointed the investigators, and now, according to the investigator, he's essentially useless. At one point, he even says it directly. Dylan is worth nothing to them as a witness. Now, remember what we're supposed to be listening to. This recording is often described as a confession. But that's not how confessions sound. It's not a story. It's nobody describing events. It's nobody volunteering details.
Do you realize the magnitude of what you have done, Dylan? Yes or no, the truth? Truth is that while sitting around smoking dope with Shane Alton, Zach Adams, Jason Autry, and you at Zach's house, no doubt, no question in anybody's mind, a plan got hatched out to not just any girl, but while sitting around smoking dope, getting high, plan got hatched out to go get Holly Bobo herself. Go get her, bring her back, and rape her. That happened. Yes or no? After that happened, what was the plan to do with Holly? You don't know what the plan was to do with Holly. What did you think he was going to do? You know what was going to happen. Was Holly Bobo kidnapped? Yes, sir. Was she raped? Yes. She raped by you? Yes, sir. She raped by Jason? Yes. She raped by Shane? Yes, sir. She raped by Zach? Yes. Now what are you going to do with her?
What happens here is not narrative. It's a rapid-fire series of yes or no questions, and those questions are not neutral. The investigator begins by stating the entire theory of the crime as if it were already proven. He describes a group of men sitting around smoking drugs. He says a plan was made to kidnap Holly Bobo. He says the plan was to bring her back and rape her. And then he asks Dylan a single question, yes or no. Did it happen? This is not Dylan explaining what happened. This is an investigator presenting a script and asking Dylan to agree with it. And once Dylan says yes to the first statement, the rest of the questions come immediately. Was Holly kidnapped? Yes or no? Was she raped? Yes or no? Did you rape her? Yes or no? Did Jason rape her? Yes or no? Did Shane rape her? Yes or no? Did Zach rape her? Yes or no? One after another. No pauses, no explanations, just confirmation. This technique dramatically limits the suspect's ability to correct the narrative because once the framework is established, every answer is forced into the structure that the investigator already has created. And the pressure in the room is intense. The investigator repeatedly tells Dylan that he's sick of pulling answers out of him. He accuses him of thinking too much before answering. He mocks him for hesitating. He threatens to walk out and end the conversation if Dylan lies again. In other words, the environment in that room is not one where someone calmly explains the truth. It's an environment where someone is being pushed, shouted at, and told that the only acceptable answers are the ones that the investigators want to hear. And that dynamic is especially important in this case because Dylan Adams has well-documented cognitive limitations. People with intellectual impairments are significantly more vulnerable to interrogation pressure. They're more likely to want to try to please authority figures. They're more likely to agree with leading questions. And they're more likely to say yes simply to stop the confrontation. In fact, this exact pattern, aggressive questioning, forced yes or no answers, and pressure to agree with investigators, appears repeatedly in documented false confessions. And that's what makes this section so troubling because at this point, the interrogation has stopped being about gathering information. It's just about locking Dylan into a predetermined story. The investigator even says something very revealing during this exchange. He tells Dylan that if he expects to be a witness in this case, he better start answering questions correctly.
You're going to get caught and you're going to go to jail. You have raped her. You've destroyed the evidence. You withheld information. Then you were given a chance to come in here tonight and freely spill your guts to us about what you know, and you made me sit in here and pull teeth. The very thing I've asked you no less than 3 times, daggum near begged you in this room to not make me do. You should have diarrhea of the mouth in here, and you're sitting here making me. Then if I ask you a question and give you a choice, you're just picking a choice. Then when I ask you another question, or he asks you some hard questions that you don't like, the question, you're just sitting here going, oh my God, what am I going to think of? What can I say? That ain't how this works. That ain't ever going to work, ever again. If you think you're going to be a witness in this case, how are you ever going to answer questions from a lawyer? Do you think someone's going to kiss your butt like I have? How do you think you're fixing to be treated? What worth are you to us as a witness if I got to sit here and go through all this hell to get an answer out of you? You're worth nothing to me doing that crap. Agreed?
Think about what that implies. By this point in the interrogation, the investigators are no longer trying to determine what happened. They are trying to shape Dylan into the witness that they want him to be. But the problem is, none of this questioning fixes the biggest issues in this entire case. The timeline, the phone evidence, the physical movements of the people involved. Those facts still exist outside this interrogation room. and they don't match the story being forced into place here, which means the more this interrogation pushes Dylan to agree with that story, the further the interrogation drifts away from the evidence itself. Now, immediately after that confrontation, something changes. Dylan starts talking, not because the interrogation suddenly becomes cooperative, not because investigators step back and let him explain anything. He starts talking because the rules of the room have just been made painfully clear. If he doesn't say what the investigators want, this interview ends. And Jeff Jackson has already made that threat explicit. If Dylan keeps leaving himself out of the story, Jackson says he's going to get up and walk out. Now that threat matters because by this point, Dylan has been told several things. He's been told that he's going to jail. He's been told investigators think he's lying. He's been told he's worthless as a witness unless he cooperates. And now he's being told that if he keeps answering the wrong way, the only person in the room who might help him is going to get up and leave. That combination creates a very powerful psychological incentive. Dylan doesn't need to know what the truth is anymore. He just needs to know what answer keeps Jeff Jackson from standing up and walking out. And that's when Dylan finally begins narrating the story that the investigators have been building all night. He starts describing the group sitting around smoking drugs. Even though he said they were shooting them up, now he says smoking. He repeats the idea that Shane brought up Holly. He says the group talked about going to get her. But even in that moment, Dylan instinctively phrases the story the way someone might if they were trying to distance themselves from it. He says, they talked about it. They came up with the plan. They decided to go get her, and Jeff Jackson stops him immediately. He interrupts Dylan and corrects him, not because the facts are wrong, but because the pronoun is wrong.
Start talking from the beginning.
Don't even make me ask you nothing. You start from the very beginning of this thing and just talk. Tell everything.
We can sit that. Shane come over. We can smoke his out for it now. Shane brought up that he knew a girl. They started talking. Shane said she was pretty. And that he said, let's go get her. And they schemed up a plan to go get her.
They schemed to get Holly Bobo.
And they talked to Shane and asked questions about when
I'm going to warn you one last time. Quit leaving yourself out of it. Quit leaving yourself out. You know I don't lie to you, correct? If you believe that with all your heart, you are as involved as anybody. Quit leaving yourself out, or I'll get up and walk out. No more, they did this, they talked about. It's the truth is we, Dylan. It's we. Because you're as big a part of it as anybody else.
Jackson tells Dylan to stop saying they. He tells him to say we. He tells him that Dylan was just as involved as everybody else, and that then he threatens him again. If Dylan keeps leaving himself out of the story, Jackson says he's done. He'll get up and walk out. The moment is incredibly revealing because at that point, the investigators are no longer asking Dylan what happened at all. They are editing the way that he is going to tell this story. They're literally correcting the grammar of the confession, changing the they into we. And that is one of the clearest examples in this entire interrogation of narrative shaping. The suspect begins describing the events, the investigator interrupts, and the investigator rewrites the structure of the statement in real time. Start again. Use we. Don't leave yourself out. Tell it the right way. This is not how a voluntary confession unfolds. A real confession usually comes out as a messy, emotional narrative. People ramble, they jump around, they remember things completely out of order. But here, the suspect is being instructed how to tell the story, and more importantly, how to place himself inside it, which means what we're hearing at this point is not Dylan Adams talking. It's Dylan Adams talking under the threat that this interrogation will end if he doesn't say it the way that the investigators want him to say it. And that's why this part is so freaking disturbing to listen to, because what you're hearing is not the discovery of truth. It's the construction of a narrative. And Dylan Adams is being told very clearly that his role in that narrative has already been decided. And that's something very strange happens, as if there hasn't been enough of this shit that just blows your mind. But now Jeff Jackson essentially begins telling the story himself. Dylan's still in the room, although I'm not quite sure why, because he could have been in another state. Because he's no longer the one that's describing what happened. Jackson is. So listen to how this unfolds.
Start again and don't leave yourself out. And I'm telling you, don't test me, Dylan. We're done. If you screw me one more time, we're done. You got that? Start again.
It was all
at the house.
Don't you know?
Zach's house.
Yes, sir. Zach's house. So, like talking about go get a girl. And Shane said Holly. Exactly why Shane said she was pretty.
You back that up. Because you'd already met her. You know she's pretty. You said she's pretty too. They said what?
Exactly. Fuck it. Let's go get her.
Fuck it, let's go get her. What happened?
And they left. They went together.
The three of them left.
Then what?
Then what?
And they came back later that day. That morning.
Now, when is the real time that they got back to Zach's house? Best you remember.
9:30 to 10.
9:30 to 10. Got back there. Brought her in. Who raped her first?
Okay.
Who raped her second?
I did.
Who raped her third?
Okay.
Did all three of you rape her anally and vaginally?
Yes, sir.
Was she bleeding?
Yes, sir.
Did she bleed all over you?
Yes, sir.
She bleed all over the floor?
Yes, sir.
We drew them out while we was talking about it earlier. And every one of y'all bent her over the end of that green leather couch and raped her.
Yes, sir.
And she bled into the floor and at the end of that couch.
Yes, sir.
And y'all stripped her completely naked of her clothes.
Yes, sir.
She have on a bra?
Yes, sir.
Color panties she had
What color panties she have on?
I think it is.
Dylan, you just saw the hottest girl ever. This is the most traumatic thing I'm assuming ever happened to your life. You know everything. If you close your eyes and think back about it, you know everything that you did see. What kind of bra does she have on?
Pinkish looking dog, reddish looking.
Pink or reddish looking bra. What'd y'all do with it?
What they did, but
All right.
colors of panties.
Colors of panties.
I was over as a girl.
Matching outfit. Stripped her down. Raped her. They throw her back in the car when they're done. Which vehicle is it?
Also 52.
And you called Shane Austin.
Yes, sir.
Now during this, Shane was there when the plan was made. Then they went and got her. They bring her back. Y'all all rape her. Then she gets carried back into Zach's bedroom. Something goes on. She's saying no, help, all that stuff that we talked about earlier. And you say you didn't go in there. You just sit on the couch. Then they come out to leave. What discussion is there between y'all? There is got to be a discussion about where they're going.
They told me he was leaving. That's all he told me.
What did he tell you to do?
He didn't know. He just told me he was leaving, and I told him I was going out there maybe.
Did you call Shane? Or did you text him? Which is it?
I texted him.
What did you text him?
There was no way.
Why'd you do that?
Was it like I asked him to?
Dylan says the group was talking at Zach's house. He says they were talking about going to get a girl. He says someone mentioned Holly, and almost immediately Jackson jumps in and begins filling in the details. He reminds Dylan that Shane said Holly was pretty. He reminds Dylan that Dylan himself said she was pretty. And then Jackson starts building the narrative out loud. They said she's pretty. Let's go get her. And now suddenly the entire plot exists in the investigator's voice, not Dylan's. And from that moment forward, the The interrogation becomes something very different from what people imagine when they hear the word confession, because Dylan isn't narrating any of the events. He's just answering confirmation prompts. Jackson asked, who raped her first? Who raped her second? Who raped her third? Did she bleed? Did she bleed all over you? Did she bleed on the floor? Then Jackson begins describing the scene himself. The green leather couch, bending her over it, the blood on the floor, the clothing being stripped off. He even starts asking about the color of her underwear. And notice something critical here. Dylan isn't offering those details. Jackson is. He is painting the picture first. And Dylan is simply confirming it with short answers. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. This is one of the most important distinctions in evaluating a confession, because a genuine confession typically looks totally different. In real admissions of guilt, the suspect usually provides unprompted details. They explain what happened. They describe the room. They describe what people said, what people did. Investigators may ask clarifying questions, but the story is driven by the suspect. Here, the opposite is happening. The story is being driven entirely by the investigator. Dylan is mostly just reacting to it. And that difference matters enormously, because when investigators supply the narrative, they are no longer testing the suspect's knowledge. They're testing the suspect's willingness to agree. And once a suspect realizes that agreement reduces pressure, while disagreement triggers confrontation, then the psychological dynamic shifts. The safest answer becomes the answer that the investigators already suggested, which is why so many of Dylan's responses in this section are short, compliant confirmations. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But even inside that compliance, something interesting slips out. When Jackson asks how Holly was killed, Dylan says something investigators clearly do not want to hear. He says he didn't kill her, and he says he doesn't know who disposed of her body. Now think about that for a moment. According to the narrative investigators have just spent the last several hours constructing, Dylan participated in the kidnapping. He participated in the rape. He was present during the entire event, but somehow he can't tell them the two most critical pieces of information in the case: who killed Holly Bobo and who disposed of her body. That's not a small problem. It's a massive one, because if someone truly participated in a conspiracy of this magnitude, kidnapping, rape, and murder, the killing and disposal of the body are not minor details. They are the central act of the crime. And yet, even after hours of pressure, threats, corrections, and narrative prompting, Dylan still cannot provide those answers, which leaves us with a disturbing possibility. What we're listening to here may not be a confession that's being uncovered. It may be a confession that's being assembled, one yes or no answer at a time. So at this point in the interrogation, the dynamics shift yet again. Jeff Jackson is no longer trying to get new information. Instead, he begins performing something that interrogation experts often call a confession ritual. And if you listen closely, you can hear the structure of it almost line by line. First comes the moral framing. Jackson tells Dylan he's committed the most horrible act imaginable. He tells him he has to accept responsibility. He tells him that he must make things right with God. But notice something important. This isn't presented as a question. It's presented as a fact that Dylan must accept. Jackson tells him, you have done the most horrible thing that you can do to another human being. You have to accept that. That's the first step of the ritual. The suspect must acknowledge guilt, not through evidence, but through moral submission. And then comes the next step. Jackson explains what the path forward looks like. Dylan is going to jail, that's already decided, but Jackson tells him that there's still a way to do the right thing. Cooperate. Accept punishment. Help the investigators. And maybe, just maybe, he can still have peace of mind. This is a very common interrogation technique. It reframes confession not as surrender, but as moral redemption. You're not confessing because you're guilty. You're confessing because it's the honorable thing to do. But then the interrogation moves into an even more powerful form of leverage. Family.
Here's what you got to accept. You've done the most horrible possible thing you could do to another human being, Dylan. You have. That don't change anything between me and you, but you got to accept that that's what you've done. Here's what else you got to accept. That you got to make that right with God in your own way somehow. But the only way you make it right to all the rest of us is keep your head out of your butt and totally cooperate with us. But you also are going to have to accept responsibility for the part of this that you played. You understand that? You know you're going back to jail. Just you telling me about what happened doesn't mean that you don't owe a debt for this. You know what we talked about the last case that you were in trouble for when you were sitting in jail when I first met you. And you know I'm in it. Once you've paid your debt to society and you're out of jail and you're a free man, you're on equal ground with me again. Because you paid your debt. You don't owe me no apology. You don't owe me nothing. You paid your debt. You sit and took your punishment and it's over. You're going to have to get your head wrapped around this. You're going to accept punishment for what you've done. But the only way that you can help make this right is that even though you're going to accept punishment for what you did for your part of this, you've got, if you ever want peace of mind and want to do the right thing and have complete closure to this, you've got to continue to cooperate with me anyway. Agreed? Is that what you want to do? No matter what it costs you.
Jackson asked Dylan a question that has nothing to do with evidence. He asks him what he wants Jackson to tell his mother. Dylan asks if Jackson can explain it to her, and Jackson refuses. He tells Dylan that's something Dylan will have to do himself. That telling his mother what he did is the first real test of whether he's taken responsibility. And then Jackson raises the stakes even further, and he tells Dylan something extremely revealing. If Dylan can admit these crimes to his mother, then maybe he can be used as a witness. Listen to that carefully.
You want me to say to your mama? What are you going to tell her? You can't ask me to do that. I've met with your mom. You know I've explained that you were trying to cooperate with us. But the truth is, at the time, you hadn't told me all this other stuff. Now your mama's going to freak out on me, right? You own that, Dylan. Look at me. You own that one. You tell your mama what you did, not me. You can't ask me to do that for you. That ain't right. And she going to hate me forever anyway, but you got to tell her what you did because she only believes what she hears coming out of your mouth. You know it from the person. You didn't believe nothing I said until I got you on the phone and you told her. When I told you, you did the right thing and tell your mama what you saw. Once you did, you saw how she changed. You got to go through the same process. You're going to have to tell her yourself. I ain't doing it for you. I refuse.
That's part of accepting responsibility.
That's your first test, Dylan. That's your first test with me and the district attorney to see if you're a man enough. If you can tell your mama the rest of this story, then there's a chance that you can be used as a witness.
A witness. Not just a suspect, not just a defendant, a witness. That moment is incredibly important because it shows the role investigators are trying to shape for Dylan. They don't just want a confession. They want a cooperating witness against the others. And that incentive matters because the moment a suspect believes that confessing might change their legal position even slightly, then the psychological pressure to comply becomes enormous. Then the interrogation turns back to the details of the alleged assault. Jackson asks Dylan how many times he penetrated Holly. He tells him the memory must haunt him every night. He tells him it must be the worst thing that he's ever done. But notice again how the framing works. Jackson isn't asking whether those things happened. He's asking how often they happened. The premise of the crime is already locked in. The only thing that Dylan is allowed to clarify is the number of times. And that's the hallmark of coercive interrogation structure. The suspect is no longer allowed to challenge the core accusation, only the details. But even after all of this pressure, the threats, the moral lectures, the promises of redemption, something critical still never emerges. Dillon cannot answer the most important questions in this case. Who actually killed Holly? Who disposed of her body? And where did that happen? Even at the very end of the interrogation, when Jackson asks how long Holly was alive, Dillon says something striking. He says he doesn't know. He says Shane might know. Think about that. According to the narrative that investigators have spent hours building, Dillon was involved in the planning. He was present during the assault. He was there during the aftermath. But he still cannot explain the moment that matters the most, the killing, the disposal of the body, which raises a very uncomfortable possibility. What investigators may have secured here is not a confession that explains the crime. It's a confession that explains their theory of the crime. And those two things are not the same, because a confession should illuminate the truth, not simply repeat the narrative that investigators have already decided has to be true. The interrogation finally winds down a little after 10 o'clock that night, and the way it ends is almost as revealing as the interrogation itself. Jeff Jackson tells Dillon that he's going to step out of the room and speak with his supervisors and the district attorney. He then says something that, on its face, sounds almost reasonable. He thanks Dillon for being, quote, man enough to come in and talk, but in the same breath, he reminds Dillon of something else. The consequences of what's happening are his own fault. He says Dillon brought this on himself, and Dillon agrees. That moment is important because it locks in the final step of the interrogation process. Dillon has now accepted the role that investigators have assigned to him. He is the guilty participant. He is the cooperating witness, and he is the man who is going to jail. But even after nearly 5 hours of interrogation, there are still massive gaps in what Dillon supposedly knows. Jeff Jackson asks him directly, do you know where Holly's body was? Dillon says, no. Do you know the area where it was? Again, no. Just think about that. According to the narrative that investigators have spent the entire evening constructing, Dillon was part of all of it. But he can't tell investigators where the body was taken, where the murder occurred. Those are not minor details. They are the central facts of the crime, and yet they remain unanswered. Then the interrogation moves into something stranger. Investigators begin trying to identify a specific house where Holly may have been held. They pull up aerial maps on a computer. They start walking through local roads, landmarks, churches, cemeteries, and driveways. They begin pointing to locations on a map and asking Dillon if that's the place. And what you hear in this exchange is not a suspect describing a location from memory. It's investigators trying to reverse engineer a location through suggestion. They propose a house. Dillon reacts. They propose another location. Dillon reacts again. Eventually, investigators settle on a house that they believe might match the description. But even then, Dillon admits something that undermines the entire premise. He says he's never actually been inside the house. He only knows about it from something that Shane supposedly said, which means that even this supposed location, the final piece of unfinished business in this interrogation, is based entirely on secondhand information, not personal knowledge. And then, after hours of questioning, the interview finally ends. The time is noted for the record, September 17th, 2014, just after 10:15 at night. But in the very last moments of the interrogation, something else just happens to slip out. Investigators ask Dillon how he knows there's a basement in the house that they've been discussing. Dillon says Shane told him. They ask a follow-up question. Did Shane specifically say that Holly was held in that basement? Dillon answers no. That detail was never actually said. In other words, Even at the very end of the interrogation, the investigators are still trying to connect pieces of a narrative that Dylan himself cannot fully confirm. Which brings us to the most important question. What exactly did investigators get that night? They did not get the location of a body. They did not get a clear description of the murder. They did not get an explanation of how the body was disposed of. What they obtained instead was a statement that confirms their theory about what happened inside Zach Adams' house. And that difference is important because a reliable confession should lead investigators to the truth. It should not simply confirm what investigators already believe to be true. And when you step back and you look at the structure of this interrogation, the threats, the corrections, the narrative prompting, the yes or no confirmations, you're left with a very uncomfortable possibility. What happened in that room may not have been the discovery of a confession at all, but just a construction of one. So let's take a pause for a moment, because we just walked through nearly 5 hours of interrogation, and if you're sitting there thinking, what the hell was all of this? Well, you're not alone. I just played you portions of it. I had to sit through this whole miserable freaking nightmare. And I've listened to a lot of interrogations over the years, some of them good, some of them bad, some of them that make you uncomfortable, but this one stands out to me. Not because it's terribly aggressive. It's not them beating him with phone books or some shit like that. Police interrogations are often aggressive, not because investigators push suspects. That happens all the time. What makes this interrogation so troubling, though, is how much of the story is being supplied by the investigators themselves. Over and over again, you hear the same pattern. The investigator describes the event, then asks Dylan to confirm it. Who raped her first? Who raped her second? Did she bleed? Did she bleed on the couch? Did she bleed on the floor? And Dylan responds mostly with 2 words. Yes, sir. But the details aren't coming from him. They're coming from the investigators. And then there's the moment where Dylan says they. The investigators stop him and say, don't say they, say we. It's not extracting a confession. It's editing one. And then there's the threats. I'm done. I'm going to walk out. You're worthless as a witness. Those are pressure tactics designed to make a suspect keep talking. Not necessarily to tell the truth, but to say whatever keeps the interrogation from collapsing. And here's the most important part. Even after hours of pressure, even after investigators have walked him through a detailed narrative of rape and murder, Dylan still cannot answer the most important questions in the case. And they're not small details. Those are the central facts of the crime, and they never get answered. So what are we left with? We are left with a statement where the investigators supply the structure of the crime, and the suspect confirms it piece by piece. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that the story is false, but it does raise a question that every investigator, every prosecutor, and every juror should ask when they hear a confession. Did the suspect tell the story, or did the investigators build it? Because those two things are not the same. At the end of the day, there's one question that matters. Not whether Dylan Adams is a good person, not whether the investigators believe that he was involved, and not whether parts of what he said might eventually line up with some other evidence. The question that matters is this: did investigators uncover the truth? Or did they construct a narrative and then teach it to the suspect until he agreed with it? Because when you listen to that interrogation carefully, start to finish, something becomes impossible to ignore. The investigators are talking far more than Dylan is. They supply the timeline. They supply the setting. They supply the details of the assault. They even correct the way that Dylan refers to the participants, changing they into we. And when Dylan hesitates, when he doesn't remember, when he doesn't know, the pressure increases. Threats, corrections, moral lectures, until eventually the conversation becomes almost entirely yes or no confirmations of a story that investigators are already telling. Now, here's the uncomfortable reality. Confessions are one of the most powerful forms of evidence in the criminal justice system. Jurors trust them. Judges trust them. The public trusts them. But history has shown us something that investigators themselves now openly acknowledge. Confessions can be wrong. Not because someone was tortured, not because someone was beaten, but because human beings, especially people under pressure with cognitive limitations, fear, exhaustion, or confusion, sometimes say what they believe they need to say to make the pressure stop. And when that happens, the interrogation room stops being a place where the truth is discovered. It becomes a place where the truth is decided first and explained later. That's why interrogations like this one deserve scrutiny. Not because questioning suspects is wrong, and not because investigators shouldn't push hard in serious cases, but because when a confession is built piece by piece through suggestion, pressure, and correction, you're left with a question that no jury, no prosecutor, and no investigator should ever ignore. Did we actually hear what happened? Or did we hear what someone was finally willing to agree to? And in this case, as serious as this is, that difference matters more than anything. So that's where we're going to leave this episode of Distilled. What you just heard was not a quick summary of a confession. It was a full walkthrough of the entire nightmare itself. The structure, the pressure, the narrative shaping, and the questions it raises about how that statement was produced. Now, as always on Distilled, the goal isn't to tell you what you have to think. The goal is to slow the case down, strip away the noise, and look closely at the evidence and the process behind it. Because when you actually listen to what happened inside that interrogation room, the real question isn't just what Dylan Adams said. It's how he said it and how the investigators got there. And that's a conversation worth having. If you want to go deeper into this case and into the cases that we cover across the Dark Dialogue Network, there's a few ways that you can support the show. First, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, make sure that you're following and subscribed so new episodes show up automatically. If you're on Apple Podcasts, a 5-star review and a short written review really help the show more than you can possibly realize. It pushes the show out to new listeners, and it helps more people discover the cases that we're covering. If you want even more content, you can join the Dark Dialogue community on Patreon. Members get access to bonus episodes, debrief conversations after major cases, research materials, and other behind-the-scenes content that doesn't make it into the public feed. You can also follow the show on YouTube, Facebook, and other Dark Dialogue platforms where we post visuals, maps, and additional material connected to the investigations. And if you want to support the work that we're doing in another way, you can check out the Dark Dialogue merchandise collections, including the Voices line that supports victim advocacy. All of those links are in the episode description, and everything can always be found at our website, www.darkdialogue.com. Most importantly, if this episode made you think, share it with someone, send it to a friend, post it, start a conversation, because the only way cases like this get the scrutiny that they deserve is when people are willing to look closely at the details. And that's exactly what we do here. I'm your host, John, and this has been Dark Dialogue Distilled. So next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep asking the questions that matter.